Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to CSIS. I hope everybody enjoyed the eclipse yesterday, and hope everybody was wearing the protective glasses that we were all supposed to wear yesterday. But welcome again to CSIS for this fourth collaboration between CSDS, the Center for Security, Diplomacy, and Strategy at the VUB in Brussels, and CSIS here in Washington, D.C. My name is Victor Cha, Senior Vice President for Asia and Career Chair at CSIS and Professor at Georgetown. This is a dialogue that we've been holding with our European colleagues now for the past few years on the Indo-Pacific. It's really a unique dialogue of sorts because only a few years ago, few would have imagined that such a dialogue would take place. The East Asian and the Indo-Pacific, I should say, and European theaters were sort of seen as two completely separate entities, at least from the perspective here in Washington. We had two sets of alliances. One of them was a set of bilateral alliances in Asia, and a much more multilateral framework in Europe, but the two were usually never mentioned in the same breath. But what we've seen over the past few years is a couple of things. One of them is a change in the U.S. alliance structure in Asia, where we're seeing much more networking among our allies, so connections building. Mini-lateralizing is sometimes how it's described among our allies in Asia. And of course, in Europe, we've seen a much greater awareness of China and the challenges that China poses, as well as on issues like economic security and supply chain resilience. The reason for this, there are many reasons, but clearly the war in Europe and its outcome has untold implications for Asia. So countries in Asia, leaders in Asia are watching very carefully and very concerned about what happens in Europe and how it would impact China's views on Taiwan. And of course, what happens between China and Taiwan would have major implications for Europe, right? So it works in many different ways. The other thing when we met this morning is we talked about the growing alignment between China and Russia. It's not an alliance by treaty, but it's an alignment that's real and that has real implications for things like defense industrial base of Russia, Russia's future defense industrial base, the way the two are colluding or cooperating in institutions of global governance like the UN, the G20, and others. So these and many other issues are things that we continue to discuss. We'll have a keynote address in a few minutes that will, I'm sure, touch on some of these issues, but let me first introduce my partner in crime in this project, Dr. Luis Simón, who is the director of CSDS.
All right. Good afternoon, and thank you, Victor. Let me start by thanking you and the CSIS team for the warm welcome, and also to the CSDS team, by the way, and the Japan chair for the effort, and the Japanese government for their ongoing support of this dialogue. We, as you were saying, Victor, we launched this dialogue back in 2021. That was our first edition in the middle of the pandemic. It was a virtual edition. And when the European Union had just published its first Indo-Pacific strategy. And then a few months after that, in February 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine. So we have spent the last three dialogues, including this one, this morning, trying to think about how to balance the need to support Ukraine with the need to keep the eye on the China and Indo-Pacific ball. And there's been a lot of debate, particularly here in the United States, about this notion of trade-offs and this idea that the resources devoted to one theater are not available or are less available, if you will, in the other theater, and the need to set clear priorities and even a hierarchy between regions. But there's also been a lot of debate lately on synergies or payoffs. This idea that standing up for global norms and principles whenever and wherever they are challenged creates a precedent. or that downgrading Russian military power today in Europe would set the foundations for a stronger U.S. rebalance towards the Indo-Pacific tomorrow. Some people are also pointing to the fact that the war in Ukraine has helped sort of revitalize the Transatlantic Alliance, but also cross-regional links between America's Euro-Atlantic and Indo-Pacific allies, as you were saying, Victor. But even if that problem set remains broadly the same, and that tension between trade-offs and payoffs remains central, a dynamic strategic and political environment in the United States, in Europe, and in the world means that the goalposts of this debate keep moving. And in particular, we are seeing that Russia's seeming military resilience and defense industrial resilience, we were talking about that this morning, but also ongoing questions about the sustainability of American and European support of Ukraine, as well as the evolving situation in the Middle East, keep complicating things and keep complicating this trade-offs versus payoffs equation. So how do we expect the war in Ukraine evolve over the next 12 months or so? Who benefits more from a protracted war in Ukraine? How does the Middle East factor into our thinking about Europe and the Indo-Pacific and cross-theater dynamics? And how may the forthcoming political elections in the United States and Europe impact on transatlantic cooperation, both in relation to China and the Indo-Pacific, but also more broadly? These are, of course, very difficult questions, but I'm hoping that today's dialogue will help us to better understand them and navigate them. That's it from me. Looking forward to the debate, and thanks again for welcoming us. Thank you.
Thank you, Luis. We'll now move to our keynote address. And so can we bring Mr. Collins up? There he is. Hi, Mike.
Hi, Victor.
So we're very happy to have Michael Collins as our keynote speaker for the 4th annual CSDS-CSIS Transatlantic Dialogue on the Indo-Pacific. Michael Collins is currently acting chair of the National Intelligence Council, Office of the Director of National Intelligence. He assumed this position in February of 2023. Prior to that, he served as Chief Strategy Officer for the Central Intelligence Agency. He also served as Deputy Assistant Director of East Asia and Pacific Mission Center from 2016 to 2020. Mike has been working on Asia for a good part of his career. He's one of our nation's top intelligence assets when it comes to the region, and also an old friend. So, Michael, I know that you are actually in D.C., but because of your schedule, we had the choice of either having you for half of the time that we've allotted for this in person, or we could have you for the full time online, and so we chose the full time online. So, let me please welcome Michael Collins to CSIS virtually. His comments today, he'll make some comments, and then if there's time, we'll have a few questions. So, Michael, thanks again for joining us, and I turn the stage over to you.
Well, thanks, Victor. Thanks, Dwayne, for the invitation. Again, please accept my apology for unfortunately having to speak remotely to this dialogue, given just too tight of a commitment back here I have to take care of. I know it's something you know well, Victor, from your time in government. Look, as many of you have heard before from me directly as head of the Intelligence Community's National Intelligence Council, the NIC, I take very seriously, as do each of the national intelligence officers who work within the NIC, what we can do to help drive and contribute to a larger national or even international analytic conversation, narratives, and even scholarship on the state of the world and the key forces driving it. And I see this dialogue today as an opportunity to do so. We require this to maximize the insight we can learn from others, to better inform the assessments we have to produce for policymakers. But we also know we can play a consequential role in forming others, challenging false narratives, and modeling the apolitical objectivity that is core to our mission and our fundamental tradecraft. Today, if I can leave you with anything most importantly, it is simply to complement CSIS and CSDS on the increasing importance of this cross-theater dialogue, the activity you're going through today. You are right to look closely at overlapping interests and strategic connections between the theaters of Europe and the Indo-Pacific and our alliances that operate within them. You are right to look at these for cross-cutting theater-specific implications, but you are just as right to consider what is happening in the broader global order and the stakes to it for all theaters, not limited to these alone. It is comparatively and objectively difficult to refer to any other point, I think, in history, and especially since the end of the Cold War, when the same international order that was as central to solving truly shared or globalized transnational challenges of the past was at the same time being contested as much as the current global order today, to the point I'm making about the criticality of these dialogues to assess not just what's happening in Europe or threats in Indo-Pacific to each other, but also to think more holistically about what else is going on in the world. This contestation is because, among other reasons, the world is more connected technologically, economically, scientifically, and even individually, as we appreciate more of the increasing consequence of non-state actors in international affairs, at the same time that the underlying norms, standards, and institutions governing these connections are either being challenged by China and other revisionist authoritarian powers who want them to align more to their preferred form of government and foreign policy tool chest, if you will, or they pertain to emerging technological or other domains for which norms have not yet even been established. This is also because other actors in this more contested international landscape, state and non-state actors alike, are themselves more uncertain about the global balance and the enduring posture, resolve, and fortitude of major powers within it, are both looking at and at the same time struggling to avoid having to choose or pick sides in some way, and are increasingly confronted with more and disinformed media narratives, a key theme that we on the NIC are taking increasingly seriously as a phenomena in international affairs in and of itself. Before I turn to say a few words just about this contested landscape of interest to both our transatlantic and our Indo-Pacific partners, let me just applaud you all for this integrated conversation you're driving. We attempt the same in the NIC, always trying to identify and assess implications of global developments and events across all of the functional regional portfolios that the NIC covers around the world, but at the same time that we dig into them individually and analyze the events alone. But we can't do this alone, and these conversations are critical. I'll speak to some of these dynamics today before turning maybe to a few questions at the back end. My points build on the discussions I know you've already had, including with policymakers. Our analysis is fundamentally intended to inform about the need for transatlantic cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. My points substantiate the cross-theater policy synchronization and collaboration generally being encouraged in this forum. My comments are not commentary on the policies themselves. To begin with, Russia's ongoing aggression in Ukraine and threats to NATO underscore a broader shadow over the rules-based international order, including over the very sanctity of sovereign and internationally recognized borders, one that extends into China's actions toward disputed claims in the Indo-Pacific as well. This provides just one example of an increasingly fragile global order we see being strained by accelerating strategic competition among major powers, especially China and Russia, with far-reaching implications, including increasing perceived or actual tests of our alliances. This is challenging longstanding rules and understandings in the international system, including those that can deter regional aggression or adversaries within it. At a more political level, competition between democratic and authoritarian forms of government that China, Russia, and other countries are fueling are at least enabling by promoting authoritarian tools, supporting other authoritarian leaderships, and spreading disinformation about democracy, rule of law, basic science, and human rights, is putting pressure on longstanding norms encouraging cooperative approaches to the global commons. For its part, in particular, China has the capability to directly compete with not only the United States, but also NATO and our Indo-Pacific allies, and to alter the rules-based global order in ways that support Beijing's power and preferred form of governance over that of NATO and our Indo-Pacific partners. This is because of its economic and techno-economic power, influence with leaders in other countries, that are similarly resisting democratic processes at home and deep transnational ties around the world, unlike anything the Soviet Union was able to leverage during the Cold War. This competition also exploits technological advancements, historically keys to the military, economic, and political advantages of NATO and Indo-Pacific Alliance partners, such as in AI, biotechnology and related biosecurity, advanced telecommunications and surveillance tools, and advanced computing, including potentially quantum developments. China is targeting these in particular to both bolster its power and resilience in the global geopolitical balance, but also to affect worldwide narratives on the same in its favor. Under President Xi, China's leadership is pursuing a strategy to boost China's overall indigenous innovation and provision of innovation and technological self-reliance, to acquire, steal, or compel the production and provision of intellectual property and capabilities from others, and to control and coercively leverage critical global supply chains, including those of importance to our NATO and Indo-Pacific partners. President Xi envisions China as a leading power on the world stage, and he and the Communist Party of China, supporting him, believe it is essential for China to project power globally, not just in the Indo-Pacific, to be able to resist U.S. and other global pressure, given they are convinced that the United States and our partners will never tolerate a powerful China. Given its ambitions, we expect Beijing will continue to use its military forces to intimidate its neighbors and to shape the region's actions in accordance with the PRC's priorities. To this end, as noted earlier, it will take cues on the potential limits or perceived limits of U.S. and U.S. partner responsiveness to the use of military or other coercive means from what happens in other conflicts around the world, including involving partners in wars against Russia or against Iran in the Middle East. And from a capability standpoint, we expect the PLA will field more advanced platforms and technologies and grow more competent in joint operations that are key to its effectiveness. The role intended for China's growing nuclear forces and cyber capabilities in this effort and the ultimate intent behind unprecedented growth in these areas also remain a key priority for us, also not unrelated to actions and perceptions of precedents established with Russia. Despite his ambitions, however, President Xi's emphasis on control and central oversight is unlikely to solve the challenges posed by China's endemic corruption, demographic decline, and structural economic constraints. Over the coming year, we assess tension between these challenges and China's aspirations for greater geopolitical power and influence will probably become all the more apparent. And China's serious demographic and economic challenges may make it even more sensitive, insecure, and even potentially aggressive, at a minimum, more unpredictable in some cases, as a global actor. The tension requires us all to talk more about not just the goals and capability of China as an increasingly assertive power in the global landscape, but also debates, including within China, over the model it's actually following and promulgating. Collectively, the threat from Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran are intersecting and evolving as these four revisionist aspirants expand collaboration through a web of bilateral and in some cases trilateral arrangements. This growing cooperation and willingness to exchange aid in military, economic, political, and even intelligence matters enhances their individual capabilities, enables them to cooperate on competitive actions, assists them in contesting the rules-based international order, and gives them each some insulation from the external U.S. and other international pressure they worry about, given our control of many of these arteries of power in the international landscape still. Simultaneously, as this world order is being challenged geopolitically, the world is beset by an array of shared universal issues requiring cooperative global solutions. For U.S. and transnational security requirements, we take these issues as seriously as we do more traditional and state-specific threats. This connection between what we consider the traditional national security conversation and the transnational one. Around the world, multiple states are facing rising and in some cases unsustainable debt burdens, economic spillovers from the war in Ukraine, and increased cost and output losses from extreme weather events, even as they continue to recover from the COVID-19 pandemic. The accelerating effects of climate change in particular are placing more of the world's population at greater risk from extreme weather, food and water insecurity, and humanitarian disasters, fueling migration, among other dynamics, and increasing the risks of future pandemics and pathogens as pathogens exploit this changing and evolving environment. Highlighting the connections and interdependencies we see between these global geopolitical and transnational challenges, in our view, the world that emerges from this tumultuous period will be heavily shaped for how the world should be best ideally governed, how societies should be organized, and which systems are most effective at advancing economic growth and benefits for all populations, as well as by the powers, both state and non-state, that prove most able and willing to identify and advance solutions to these global commons. New opportunities for collective action with state and non-state actors alike will emerge out of these complex and interdependent issues. And to this end, dialogue such as the one you are having today will help NATO and our Indo-Pacific partners be positioned to provide a voice and solution for pressing global issues, as well as a counter-narrative to claims being made by China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran, and others espousing an authoritarian approach. Unlike most of the IC, I think as Victor knows, I tend to be an optimist, a unicorn in the IC, I would say. This is due to the inherent shared interests and values I know underpin our alliances across the regions as represented today, as well as to their accountability ultimately to the objective truth. The more deeply transactional, even if strategic, underpinnings of the ties we see among our authoritarian rivals and their dependence on fabricated narratives, falsehoods, and in some cases outright lies, in our view, is a major serious liability, both internationally and domestically to their home audiences. Victor, thanks for the opportunity. I look forward to hearing how this conversation continues. Please again accept my apology for having to do this remotely, but I do have some time for any questions you might have from the audience. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Michael, so much. That was really a terrific set of remarks. Let me begin by, because we have a few minutes for questions. Let me begin by asking you. Two questions. And the first, first I want to applaud you for your optimism. And I do agree with you in the sense that even though many things are contested, the objective truth still, there is an objective truth that that can influence the way people think, and therefore I do congratulate you on the work you're doing on disinformation, because I agree it's extremely important. But one of the things that we discussed this morning, and you referred to it, was the growing connections between these different actors in the region now, these different revisionist actors, in particular the relationship between China and Russia. This morning we were describing it more as, it's not an alliance, but it's certainly an alignment. And alignments are quite substantial. I mean, we can't measure alignments in terms of our treaty alliances. In the history of alliances, alignments are actually quite substantial. Wars have been fought, right, between countries that have been aligned but not allied with each other. And I guess the question there is, in particular, like, at what cost is China willing to accept this alignment? It's clearly transactional. As you said, China is seeking to build an order. I don't think Russia is seeking to build an order, but they're certainly trying to destroy one. And they both want to see a weaker United States. So I guess the first question is, how far is China willing to go? And how do you think about the costs that China incurs? And is there a limit? That's the first question. The second is a much simpler question, and that is to get your take on how China is thinking about the incoming government in Taiwan. The Taiwan issue, of course, is very important, not just to the United States, but also to Europe. The incoming Lai government is a bit of a black box. I mean, we know some of the actors, but we don't really know how Lai himself thinks about issues, and in particular how the Chinese perceive Lai or plan to treat him. So any thoughts on those two sets of topics would be great, and then if there's time, we'll take some from the audience as well. Thanks.
Thanks, Victor. Great questions as always. Just I'll say a few words. First on the relationship between China and Russia, in particular China's view of Russia. as we have said in other fora, right now we're seeing the government of China, at the same time, of course, a lot of what is driving PRC strategic calculus depends upon, of course, their view of what they see the international community in the West and the United States in particular, how we are responding to China, to the point I said earlier about they do inherently believe in their own narrative that the United States and our partners are pushing back against China's rise. It's a narrative that Xi Jinping espouses clearly. At the same time, clearly, I think in recognition of the world's response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the increased solidarity that emerged from that, particularly in Europe, but also in the Indo-Pacific, challenges the government of China is wrestling with at home, and trying to set a more level or stable balance with the United States. We see China is not trying to be the provocateur or not trying to upset the apple cart too much. They take seriously the image, the reputation they're trying to encourage, that China and elements of China, including its companies, are a legitimate, safe player in the international space. So they're thinking they have to be wrestling with, how much their support for Russia could tarnish the other things they're trying to accomplish to that end. Clearly, we assess by the way in which they've handled U.S. and partner actions pertaining to support for Russia to be supportive of some measures, while at the same time trying to protect Russia from heavy economic losses, show that is a factor. That is their so much that it gets them in a position that hurts them themselves, including economically. I would just restate the point I think you made as well. I touched on it. This is not an alliance. They have an inherent, they have a mutual interest, of course, in balancing the West, and they have an interest in each other's respective success in doing so. And we see them and other actors trying to benefit off the backs of what each of them are doing individually against the United States and our partners. But I will state the point I made earlier. I still think they're challenged by, unlike in the case of our relationships, a lack of an inherent shared interest or institutionalized commitment to other partners in the form of our alliances, that, for what we have. So it'll be an interesting year to follow this, in particular for what happens in the Russia-Ukraine war. At the same time that, as I said earlier, we see the leadership of China trying to level set a bit its image in the world and its relationships with the West in particular. I think the same dynamic plays in part, to the Taiwan issue. You have seen, others have commented on how they would otherwise perhaps have wanted the election in Taiwan to play out. Most sensitive, obviously, in the coming months and year ahead to what the new administration may do that might suggest pull away from integration, and how actions in Taiwan, as well as the responsiveness of the international community, could be perceived as actions that could be interpreted as greater separation between Taiwan and China of some permanent nature. In our view, those are hard issues for China to potentially accept. Again, at the same time, I would say this in the context of what I said earlier as it pertained to Russia. They're going to be challenged as well by a desire to think about its economy, the relationships it needs for its economy, to not be seen potentially as too aggressive in its response to that issue and related to other issues, I would say, in the Indo-Pacific. I'll just say, I think we expect, last point, as we have said about their preparations to build capability over the longer term to be ready if a decision is made to do something about Taiwan. As I referenced in my points, we expect them to continue to build out the capabilities they think is necessary to give them that capability if a decision is ever made to have to use them against Taiwan. We expect that pattern to continue over the given year at the same time that they're wrestling with this issue diplomatically. So.
Thank you, Michael. So we'll open the floor. If there are any questions, just please raise your hand. We have two here, so if we could get We have 3, 4. Oh, my goodness. Okay, so let's get the mics. Time is limited, so please be brief with your questions. Mike, we'll take all 4 of them together, and then you can...
Yeah, that's probably best.
Yeah,
I got about...
You can answer the easy ones and not answer the hard ones. So, okay. Please, yeah.
Hi, thank you. Secretary Yellen has said that decoupling from China is impossible, but some of the disinformation points that you've made clearly impinge on trade and investment integration with China. A good example is TikTok. So could you speak just a little bit about how you think about U.S. trade and investment policy in the context of this fight against disinformation or false narratives?
Yeah, thank you. I'm Mark Tokala from KEI. You couch the competition in terms of democracies against authoritarian states. But is there room for the United States and its allies to work with illiberal regimes in opposing Russian and Chinese malign behavior? Is that necessary, or is the price too high to pay for that?
Hello there, my name is Sidral Apuri, and my question is, given the increased risk of climate disasters such as increasing droughts, unpredictable monsoon weather in the Indo-Pacific region, what steps do you think we can take from a national security perspective to do more risk management with our partners in the Indo-Pacific to mitigate these potentially catastrophic climate risks?
Hi, thank you. My question is following up on your comments about China's unprecedented nuclear growth and the key priority of trying to understand that growth in the context of its ongoing strategy. My question is, how does the intelligence community assess China's shift or intentions or ultimate goals with its nuclear growth? Is it sufficient just to look at its growth year to year based on the Pentagon reports? Or what are we looking to see beyond just the growth or China's leadership statements? Thank you.
Great. All great questions. Thank you all for being concise. So, Mike, over to you.
Thank you. I'll try to go through each of these with the time I have here left. On the first one, I think this issue over, I'll speak into this as an analyst here, of course, this issue of the decoupling or de-risking related to the point made about disinformation. We take seriously, and this is where I think our partnership with the private sector all the more, and the academic and private sector more broadly, is increasingly significant to the analysis that we should be producing, we need to produce for our policymakers and for others, about how we objectively look at our various ecosystems. And I think it's exposing, at the same time, as I said earlier up front, the government of China is doubling down on a model that says they want to control, they want self-reliance, they want independence, they want authority over the technologies that operate globally, but of course domestically. I think that reveals something about the state of China, in particular the Communist Party of China, their need to worry more, I would say, comparatively about the control of their population and their various non-state actors, for the model they espouse. And there is a contest over whose systems, I would say, are stronger. And this is where I think it'll be both interesting and important to be a part of it, but also, frankly, as an analyst, being an observer of how the broader academic and private sector community, both within the liberal international order and those within China, start talking more objectively and even scientifically about which ecosystems, frankly, are better for developing technologies in certain areas or solving hard problems, as I said earlier. As just one example, the COVID-19 pandemic and the false narratives that were being promulgated about what vaccine works and which one doesn't, and where this, the science behind this whole issue, and frankly, to the point about our different standards, the doctor in Wuhan that wasn't allowed to express, his view, freedom of expression. So Anyway, long way of saying I think there's a fascinating issue here for us to continue to explore about the standards and the values and the requirements we all have for, I know the question was also asked as it pertained to TikTok, but the standards and norms and values that underpin the technologies and our regulatory frameworks or otherwise that we adhere to both encourage innovation, but also to protect ourselves against threats from them compared to different standards and values, I would just say, that are promulgated by a more authoritarian state, included in China. On the question about democracies, yeah, I apologize if I used the word too tightly. There are, of course, by definition, thoroughly democratic states around the world that we all recognize and see interest in partnering with, and in some cases inherent true overlapping interests. I think it's worth considering more broadly those who support a more liberal, open international framework and the reliance on truth and fact and accountability and legal standards that hold all of us accountable to those relative to governments within which those standards are being challenged, as I said earlier, whether it's over the use of force or the approach to using technologies in different ways that in some cases potentially could violate the sovereignty of other states, certainly over the protection and ownership of data pertaining to those technologies. On climate, I'd stress that, and I do think it's a critical, as I said, critical transnational issue in and of itself for so many derivative issues that play off of that. Whether it's on migration, food insecurity, and all the other issues, economic dislocations that affect other issues around the world that we have to stay on top of from a national security perspective in and of themselves, as well as issues with which we are competing with adversaries to address. I guess the question as to what we could do about it, I would refer back, frankly, to this dialogue and to the point I made earlier about the standards and the science that we can openly speak to and the facts and objectivity underpinning them for ensuring conversations about what to do about this issue, how to address it, are objectively informed as opposed to ideologically informed. I'll leave it at that. And the last question on China's nuclear force growth, yeah, it's an issue we take very seriously. I would just say it's another affirmation in our view of China recognizing it's looking for means to better be able to contest with and potentially balance the United States and to deal with any asymmetric disadvantages they may currently see, to put them in a better position if necessary to have to counter or even potentially contest the United States and our partners in a conflict. So,
Michael, you've been very generous with your time, and we're very grateful for that. Thank you for all the work you're doing, all your service, and we hope to see you in person next time at CSIS. So thanks again.
Let's do that.
Thanks.
Let's do that. Thank you, Victor, and thanks everybody else.
So we will move right into our program now, and I invite our speakers to join us on the stage. I believe Max Bergman, Director of the CSIS Europe program, will be chairing this session. So Max?
Good afternoon, everyone. I really want to thank Victor and Luis for their partnership in making sure that this dialogue continues. This is essentially, I think, my second anniversary, or I'm about to accomplish 2 years at CSIS, and one of the first acts that I did was introduce, I think, this event 2 years ago. And Luis Simón is a non-resident with the Europe program, but I think he probably has, in some ways, more action and activity with Victor's program on the Asia side, and I think that is a testament to how interlinked the theaters are, and that Luis and CSDS has really led the way, I think, in thinking in Europe on when it comes to Asia. We have an excellent panel here today to talk about the Washington Summit and the future of NATO's China and Indo-Pacific policy. I'm going to introduce our speakers quickly, and then we'll launch into the discussion. To my immediate left is Dr. Benedetta Berti. Benedetta has served for 6 years as head of policy planning in the Office of the Secretary General at NATO. Before that, she was an Eisenhower Global Fellow and a TED Senior Fellow. Benedetta is also associate researcher at the Institute for European Studies and a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. In the past, she has held positions at West Point, the Institute for National Security Studies, and Tel Aviv University, among others. To her left is Satoru Mori. He is the Deputy Director of the Keio Center for Strategy and a professor at Keio University. Since 2018, he has also been a senior researcher at the Nakasone Peace Institute. Previously, he served as special advisor and senior fellow at the National Security Secretariat from 2016 to 2019. And then last but certainly not least is my colleague Jude Blanchette. Jude holds the Freeman Chair in China Studies here at the Center for Strategic International Studies. Previously, he was engagement director for the Conference Board's China Center for Economics and Business in Beijing, where he researched China's political environment with a focus on the workings of the Communist Party of China and its impact on foreign companies and investors. And I should say I'm Max Bergman. I'm the director of the Europe, Russia, Eurasia program. So let's dive into the conversation. Benedetta, I want to start with you. So NATO just turned 75 last week. There was, I think, a big party in Brussels. There's events taking place in across Europe. I think in Rome there's an event happening next week. But when it comes to the Indo-Pacific, maybe you could talk about the upcoming summit and then what has changed since you've been in the chair at NATO at policy planning when it comes to thinking about the Indo-Pacific.
Okay, thank you. I am tempted to say that party and Brussels are oxymorons, but I will move swiftly forward and address your question.
Lots of speeches were given.
Yes, lots of speeches. That's more Brussels style. I'll try to be very brief, but I think the question is very important. Maybe I'll just say a couple of words to frame the discussion before we get into the nitty-gritty of the deliverables for the Washington summit. And I think that it is a fact that especially since 2019, there's been a growing interest in NATO as an alliance and from European allies in NATO in both thinking about the Indo-Pacific. Partly this has been driven by an increased awareness, understanding, and concern over the China challenge, but I would say it's actually broader than that. And so, first of all, I want to talk about what this is not about, and then talk a little bit about what it is, I think it is about, and how growing cross-theater dialogues is part and parcel of our adaptation. So what the increased attention towards the China challenge and the Indo-Pacific theater is not about, in my opinion, it's about the alliance NATO reassessing its purpose. The purpose remains very much ensuring the collective defense of allies. It is not about reassessing its area of operation, its area of responsibility, which remains the Euro-Atlantic area. But it is a lot more about understanding that in order for NATO to fulfill that core mandate and to ensure the security and defense of allies, it can no longer afford to be a one theater, only focused alliance, and it really needs to understand the interlinkages between theaters, domains, and actors. And without going into a 75 years history of NATO, which I'm sure would not make you very happy, I would say if during the Cold War, NATO was a one theater alliance, one threat, one theater, and then we had this 30 post-Cold War peace dividend era where we really thought about threats in a diffuse theater-based manner. Since 2014, NATO is in the midst of the most significant shift in its deterrence and defense posture to once again solve the problem of ensuring the territorial defense of Europe, but it does so in a security environment where it really needs to think about connecting those dots. And that's the entry point into looking at the security interlinkages between Euro-Atlantic and Indo-Pacific. And I think you see that very clearly in the 2022 strategic concept, which is essentially the alliance strategy, which looks at the world through three main interrelated threats. trends. It is the rise of strategic competition, it is pervasive instability, and is recurrent strategic shocks. And when you look at these trends, you see they really defy dichotomies in terms of, they break the dichotomies in terms of theaters. That's very true within the Euro-Atlantic theater itself, where we used to think about the eastern flank being only about conventional threats and the southern flank being only about asymmetric ones like terrorism or instability. And today we see that those theaters are really connected. Those strategic landscapes are connected by the growing impact and influence of the Russian Federation, both to our eastern and our southern flank, the growing footprint of the PRC, again, eastern and southern flank, et cetera, et cetera. So that strategic connection between flanks is very prominent in the Euro-Atlantic area, but more broadly, we talk more and more about how we need to deal with transnational threats that, again, are not bound by geography, terrorism, climate change. But I would say that strategic competition adds an additional layer, blurring geographical and geostrategic proximity very much. And I would say that that's particularly true when you look at the Euro-Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific theaters, because the security interlinkages there, at least in my opinion, are incredibly relevant. And for example, a security instability, conflict, a serious deterioration of security in the Indo-Pacific would have a direct impact on Euro-Atlantic security, and vice versa. And in that sense, it's clear that there is an interest in free, open Indo-Pacific that's in the interest of Euro-Atlantic security as well. And Ukraine is the test case, right? And I think our Indo-Pacific partners, for NATO, Australia, Japan, the Republic of Korea, New Zealand, understand that connection very well. They understand that a strategic failure of deterrence in Europe would have a very negative effect in the Indo-Pacific. And Ukraine, in a way, is a test case. We see increasing, I would say, concerted action by assertive authoritarian actors, the PRC, Russia, Iran, the DPRK, testing very much the free world or the transatlantic and trans-Pacific alliance in Ukraine. So I close here to say that on that basis, we're really understanding how do you prepare as NATO for a world of growing strategic competition. And part of that is understanding and operationalizing those connections between theaters. And the second element is operationalizing the fact that in a world of strategic competition, we see the increased use of kinetic and non-kinetic means to challenge our security, and that brings the PRC challenge not very near to European capitals through economic coercion, disinformation, strategic investments to create strategic dependencies, et cetera, et cetera. And that requires, and I stop here, as a response, not just rebuilding our military instruments of power, which is very much what we have been doing over the past 10 years, but also I think more and more thinking about what is the integrated deterrence conversation that we can have with our Indo-Pacific partners when it comes to building resilience, ring-fencing our democracy, industrial sectors, and really promote a more robust approach to countering the various forms of authoritarian coercion. And of course, working with Indo-Pacific partner is essential to that. So that's the quickest I can explain how I see the transition in our strategic thinking with respect to why the Indo-Pacific matters to us today.
Let me just follow up and ask you about the upcoming summit. There's I think been a lot of language, and in the past two summits, particularly in 2022, you've had the leaders of the AP4 of Australia, Korea, Japan, and New Zealand come to the NATO summits. Is that expected again? What are we sort of building here toward? I guess so. Maybe two questions. One, are there kind of tangible things that you're hoping that will come out of this summit? And then what's the sort of long-term goal? What are we sort of building here?
Right, so I think there has been a steady progression, first of all, in terms of political and strategic dialogue, and that really has been very, I would say, instrumental in helping NATO build greater transatlantic convergence over understanding, for example, what the security situation in the Indo-Pacific is, what the parameters of the China challenge are, and why that matters so much. So that strategic dialogue has been, I think, increasing over the past few years. And as you mentioned, Washington, the upcoming summit would be the third time in 3 years where heads of state and government from Indo-Pacific partners are invited to participate. And that's, of course, a political signal of its own. Of course, political signals are important, but they are not enough. And that's why a lot of the work is actually bilateral between NATO and the four individual IP4 countries in terms of what are the areas of mutual cooperation, mutual learning, and partly it's on issues ranging from cyber defense and security to defense innovation to promoting resilience, supply chain security. It's really quite broad. And if I look into the future, I think there's also a lot of opportunities for mutual learning. For example, and this is just brainstorming that I'm curious to hear the comments from the much more subject matter-based experts in the panel. But for example, as Indo-Pacific partners think growingly about operationalizing integrated deterrence in their theaters, I think there may be some interesting exchanges we can have from a Euro-Atlantic perspective in terms of how do we do C2, how do we do exercises, how do we promote interoperability, interchangeability, common standards, and how we can work around these common issues, because I think that's where we have a strong added value. So again, not about expanding NATO's military footprint in the Indo-Pacific, but about adding value by sharing experience, sharing information, but also building that convergence between the two alliances over countering economic coercion and counter-authoritarian coercion are large, and ring fencing in a world of growing strategic competition. So that's what I see in the future.
So Tora, maybe I'll ask you for the Japanese perspective. This is Japanese week here in Washington. The Prime Minister is here. We just had our Japanese cherry blossom season, has now, I think, fully passed. But what is Japan's perspective on NATO's role in the Indo-Pacific? There's been a lot of engagement between Japanese leaders and attending the NATO summits. How do you view things from Japan, from NATO? How do you see the NATO's role in the region?
Okay, thank you very much. I'll try to be brief, but I think when it comes to Japan's views on NATO or NATO's role in the Indo-Pacific, I would probably have to point out that Japan sees an increasing overlap of our security outlook between Japan and NATO. And I think it comes in three forms. Number one, as Benedetta eloquently explained, there is this increasing awareness that security in the Indo-Pacific and Euro-Atlantic are interconnected. That's number one. I think it's been clearly stipulated in 2022 strategic concept, as well as remarks in Secretary General Stoltenberg. And Prime Minister Kishida, as you may know, often alludes to this analogy between, Ukraine today could be East Asia's tomorrow. And I think in the coming up Prime Minister's speech at the Congress, he'll probably allude to this kind of security outlook once again. That's what I would expect to see. So that's number one. Number two is that the way we approach China, I think, is quite similar. Even though we do see China's quasi-policies as undermining our interest, security, and values, and it presents a sort of a systemic challenge, we also do see the need for diplomatic engagement. And this is not to suggest that we're going to accommodate Chinese demands or interests and so forth. It's more to do with, trying to disabuse of any sort of misunderstanding and misperceptions about what we want. But I think it's both NATO and Japan sees China as a significant challenge to the international order, and yet we do not exclude the room for diplomatic engagement. So that's the second view that we share with NATO. And thirdly, this growing concern over strategic partnership between China and Russia is also growing. For Japan, we've been seeing a lot of naval activities around Japan, but it's not only that. I think collaboration between Russia and China. And essentially, China's economic relationship with Russia is actually sustaining Russia's war effort and invasion in Ukraine. And I think the biggest challenge that, well, should I say, Japan's vigor in engaging NATO comes because of this Ukraine issue. And Japan's stake in that is that it's not, we often say that we would not accept the revision of the status quo by force, and that we want to uphold the rules-based international order. But it's not only that, but I think this is also a test case for whether US allies can actually sustain an aggrieved state during a protracted war. And we don't want to make either Russia or China believe that if they can get a conflict into a protracted mode, they would somehow be able to wear us out. And we don't want to make that kind of, provide that kind of feedback to neither Russia nor China. So I think one of the biggest challenges moving forward is to come up with a sort of an architecture that would sustainably support Ukraine's effort in pushing back Russian invasion. So those are some of the elements that sort of underpin the way we view our cooperation with NATO. And in terms of NATO's role in the Indo-Pacific, I also want to echo Benedetta's remark about some of the areas of cooperation. Japan has this individually tailored partnership program. And the current, I think, program runs from 2023 to 2026, and we have identified something like 16 areas of cooperation. And in that, we cooperate on cyber defense. I think we also talk about capability development and interoperability. And there are many, many issues that where we can cooperate. But I think the main sort of, how should I say, engagement vehicle would come in the form of political/security cooperation, as you mentioned. And when it comes to more sort of a harder defense military cooperation, I think it's going to be more based on individual European countries. For example, countries like UK and France and so forth, those countries may have the possibility of providing some sort of a more, how should I say, concrete military/defense cooperation. But for NATO, I think there are those 16 areas, I think, are already moving. So those areas are helpful. And I think NATO also has those programs with South Korea as well. And so that kind of individual country-focused engagement by NATO in the Indo-Pacific is very helpful. And I think it makes sense for the heads of leaders meeting, where our Prime Minister goes to NATO heads of state meeting to sort of express political support and try to push forward some of those cooperation programs. Those efforts are generally received as very positive in Japan. So I'll stop here.
Let me follow up. Was part of the thought process also in the kind of Japanese engagement with NATO, but also support for Ukraine? It has been described to me as that part of this was, I mean, Japan was clearly shocked by Russia's invasion, the violation of sovereignty, and the outrage that was clear when Russia invaded. But there was also an element of, well, we're demonstrating to Europe that we're there for you, and we hope that if something were to happen, that you would be there for us. Is that also part of the kind of logic and thought process here from Japan and from other countries in the region?
Yes, I would agree. Yes, I think the kind of mindset that we want to build up is all for one kind of approach, where U.S. allies come together to deal with the situation in Ukraine. But if we have, for example, a Taiwan contingency, I mean, it's not like we would like to have NATO suddenly embark on a sort of a collective response in a Taiwan contingency or anything. But there are many ways for individual countries and non-military political/security cooperation where NATO can possibly help us if we were to face a severe situation. So. Yeah, I think that's the kind of expectation that we have. We don't necessarily explicitly mention that, but I think among experts and policy elites, those thinking are very much prevalent, I would say. Yeah.
Now, last year at the Vilnius summit in Lithuania, there was an effort prior to that summit for NATO to open a liaison office in Tokyo. This was not going to be this wasn't, NATO opening a military base. This was going to be one or two people. But ultimately, there was division within the alliance, with certain countries deciding that wasn't the direction they wanted NATO to go. Did that have any did that leave a bitter taste in the mouth of officials in Japan, or what's the kind of reaction to that effort and that not having succeeded?
Little bit of bitter feeling maybe, but I think the Japanese thinking was basically we don't want to push for anything that would divide, create new divisions within the alliance. So we would have to wait. And if we were to sort of move forward with practical cooperation, all countries will probably see the practical need for having permanent staff in Tokyo. So, yeah, rather than pushing forward with this, where some countries like France does not really go on board, we can basically wait. And it's not like we have been our security is significantly undermined by this, because we already have this cooperation going on. So that's the kind of atmosphere that we have in Tokyo. Yeah.
Great. Jude, I want to turn to you to maybe offer, you can maybe put well, you always have a China hat on, but how does Beijing view the increased interactions, engagements, the relationships that are developing between NATO and countries in the Indo-Pacific? We haven't really mentioned, but there's an increasing amount of defense industrial engagement with the Poland buying Korean tanks, for instance, Japan cooperating with the UK and Italy on the future next generation fighter. How does China perceive of this, and do they view this as sort of benign, or are they concerned?
I think there's two levels to this. One is how China looks at NATO itself, and then there is the other, which is the idea of NATO and how Beijing tries to instrumentalize narratives around the idea of NATO and Asian NATO as a way to puncture or tear at the fabric of this growing sort of lattice work of U.S. alliance and partnerships. So, Beijing has been watching and engaging with NATO since the very beginning of NATO's existence, and has had fluctuating views on NATO. When NATO, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, so there were large swaths of the 1970s where China was actually pushing for NATO expansion because the Soviet Union was the target, and that was the time of the Sino-Soviet split. I think for a lot of Chinese, just saying the word NATO is triggering because in the modern era, they think of the unintentional bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade and the death of 3 Chinese nationals, which is why it's so easy for Beijing to weaponize a NATO narrative. So I think on a substantive level, Beijing is increasingly worried by, I'd say this, especially, certainly since the invasion of Ukraine, but really going back a decade of further integration between U.S. partners and allies in a whole range of defense initiatives, military engagement, co-production. And so when they were as they watched these conversations emerging in the strategic concept, but elsewhere about NATO finding ways to, begin looking at the Indo-Pacific and find ways to coordinate or at least expand its aperture to see that the theaters are interconnected. I think, of course, that sets off Beijing's concern. Beijing is always concerned of what it considers to be encirclement by liberal democracies and the thought of liberal democracies working in closer cohesion. I think certainly unnerves Beijing. But more substantively, prior to the invasion of Ukraine, Beijing wasn't really talking about NATO. You'd be hard-pressed to find it in foreign ministry statements. You'd be hard-pressed to find it in bilateral meeting statements. That all changed in February of 2022. And the narrative from Beijing has been pretty consistent from day one. NATO caused the war in Ukraine. NATO is a puppet of U.S. hegemonism, and this idea of NATO's sort of eastward expansion, which doesn't exist but Beijing frames as an ongoing development, is going to bring that conflict and instability to the Indo-Pacific or to Asia. And that is a cynical, instrumental narrative where Beijing is trying to essentially weaponize concerns about concerns around the Indo-Pacific in states that are, Singapores of the world, that are worried about conflict in the region, whether that's a Taiwan contingency, whether that's concerns about North Korea, and essentially trying to really play on those. And so I think, narrative number one is Beijing plays up the idea that NATO is looking to expand into Asia without any evidence, and you ask them what exists that has an Article 5 commitment, and they can't point to it, but it's this view that if you take it, if you play up conversations that NATO is having, this is an inevitable eastward lurch. The second point is they're trying to use these fears to tear at some of the initiatives that the United States, Japan, Korea Philippines have been driving over the past, 4 or 5 years by essentially framing Quad, AUKUS, Japan, ROK, US Trilat as if you add them together, they are basically NATO. And again, the narrative is NATO caused the war in Ukraine. This is now coming to the Indo-Pacific. And if there is conflict, it's going to be the fault of the United States and its hegemonic intentions. I think the third, maybe interesting additional layer of this is there's a larger argument Beijing is making, which is the U.S.-led, Western ally constructed international order that began after World War II is fraying and dying. And NATO is a sort of a last gasp of that. And so painting NATO as something which has brought instability to Europe, which is going to bring instability in Asia, guess who has solutions? China. Things like the Global Security Initiative, right? The Global Development Initiative. We've got new governance architecture for the 21st century that is going to be much better suited to the Global South, and as Beijing frames it, a sort of more democratized security and development order. So I think there's a couple layers of the game that Beijing is trying to play to both sort of play at the seams of U.S. allies and partners, to paint things like AUKUS and Quad as NATO light, but then also to make a sort of a larger argument of the U.S.-led order is dying, and we, China, are here with solutions that will actually bring peace and development.
Great. Well, let me ask you to maybe take off your CCP hat and put on the USA hat. So what do we...
That statement could be misinterpreted.
Yeah, it could be misinterpreted. No, but I think you provided excellent analysis of how China perceives NATO. But so what... As someone who focuses on China, focuses on U.S. strategy in the Indo-Pacific, in Asia, and is not someone that is focused on NATO, but focused on the Indo-Pacific, what role do you see in NATO playing, or NATO Indo-Pacific engagement? How central is that? How do you see this evolving? What is the strategy here? How does this fit into broader U.S. strategy toward China?
I think the first, analytic thought with my analytic CCP hat, it's not a real CCP hat, but is, I would say this is not a partisan statement. It's not meant to be, but the past several years of initiatives coming out of the Biden administration, but really also coming out of Tokyo, coming out of Manila, coming out of Seoul, have, I think, for the first time in a long time, really confused Beijing and put it on the back foot. And when you hear them describe this as these are all Cold War U.S. lackeys, that's really a desperate plea of Beijing, which is now confronting a dramatically more reinvigorated security environment than it's really had to deal with in a long time. I think the second, so just statement number one is I think the new latticework structure of reinvigorating old institutions like the Quad, building new ones like AUKUS, is having a meaningful effect of confusing Beijing's deterrent equation. I think we don't know with precision exactly how it's affecting the deterrence, because a lot of that is how Xi Jinping and others are perceiving this. But it's clear from our discussions with them, public messaging, private messaging, that this is throwing them off balance. So I think the second is, Beijing in many ways, I know Benedetta said there's other reasons, but Beijing has in many ways provoked by its own behavior and is driving these conversations, including NATO now seeing a bridge between the European theater and the Indo-Pacific. And that bridge in many ways is Russia. which is, as the comment was made, that relationship is not lagging, it's deepening, it's growing, it's expanding. Certainly there's limitations to it, but I think every year since the invasion of Ukraine, I've been surprised at how much the two are willing to do. Putin's going to be in Beijing in May. This is the 75th anniversary of the Russia-China relations. There's going to be a big event around that. We've seen that sustained economic support by China has played an absolutely vital role in Russia's ability to continue to prosecute the war. We're seeing interesting developments between North Korea and Russia, which Victor Cha's here. They've done great work tracking. So clearly the war in Ukraine is in and of itself driving security changes aided and supported by China that is strengthening old relationships, bringing new partners in, which is going to demand new thinking about what security looks like. And then the final point is Beijing would love nothing more than a world where it's essentially China versus the United States. And so I think continuing to build out, reinvigorate, revive, expand on security architecture only plays a helpful role in ensuring that Beijing understands the price for its belligerence. And final point, I think why the NATO discussions are also really important is Beijing looks at those as barometers for how individual European states think about China. And so when some countries which will go unnamed, object to the opening of a small office in Tokyo.
You can name them.
France. It gives Beijing some hope that there seems to play in other elements of the relationship. So I think a tighter NATO focus and a tighter NATO cohesion in thinking about the Indo-Pacific has spillover benefits of ensuring that Beijing understands that there is an increasing coalition that is being formed, driven by Beijing's own behavior, which is going to think about competition with China in the security realm, in the economic, and in the diplomatic realm.
I should say, just to defend France, that it wasn't the only country. It's just always willing to say.
Well, my last name is Blanchette, so I have the bona fides to criticize France.
Well, Benedetta, I want to turn back to you. I had a number of years ago, I was in the Baltic states, and I was in a hotel, and I flipped on the television. I didn't look at what channel was on the TV, and suddenly heard a news segment about air intercepts and how sovereign territory was increasingly being violated. Now, I assume this was the Baltic states, that they were talking about Russia, and then I looked at the channel and saw, oh, it's NHK talking about how Japanese airspace was constantly being violated by the Chinese. So it strikes me that there's a lot to talk about in terms of exchanging information about security threats. Jude mentioned China's support for Russia. We have a report coming out looking at Russia's defense industry, and it's pretty clear after Xi and Putin met in March of last year that dual-use technology dramatically increased, and that's really fueling Russia's defense industrial buildup. So are those conversations happening at NATO? Is this right now, are we kind of in the getting to know you stage still of these relations, where it's leaders coming to summits and meeting, but is there more happening kind of beneath the kind of the public speeches that we'll see come July?
So I think we are beyond the just getting to know you stage. If I go back, the getting to know you stage, I think centered on how NATO started really reflecting on what does it mean, does the China challenge mean to Euro-Atlantic security, really started in 2019. And back then it was really getting to know you. Back then it was really, there were hesitance from some allies with respect to does the Indo-Pacific even matter? Other allies were wondering whether NATO was the right platform to discuss the China challenge. Because again, the Euro-Atlantic focus of the alliance has to remain front and center. And back then, really, there was this big open question: does it matter? Does it influence Euro-Atlantic security? And what are really the challenges and opportunities? And if you read the statements today, we are miles away from that. Nobody's talking about challenges and opportunities. We're talking about the PRC stated objectives and coercive policies and behavior on the global stage as posing a systemic challenge to our security, our interest, and our values. So I think that getting to know the challenge stage really has been steadily progressing since 2019. And today, and I would say from where I sit, that's probably the biggest achievement of having these discussions in NATO. There is a transatlantic convergence over what that challenge looks like. There are differences in how to approach it. There are different nuances in how to balance the different strategic interests. But if I go back to 2019 and I compare the initial discussions of what the PRC means to European and Euro-Atlantic security, and now I have the same discussion in 2024, we're miles ahead. Now there is a convergence that there are security concerns, whether it's about military modernization, lack of transparency or interest in arms control, whether it's about increased economic coercion, strategies to leverage strategic dependencies. All of these are shared concern across the Atlantic, and that was not the case 3 years ago, only a short 3 years ago. And I think the connection, the dialogue, and the strategic exchange with Indo-Pacific partners have really contributed to that, just to really get the perspective from the region about why this matters to us. And very importantly, and I'll close here, I think this conversation are also really supporting that point that was made, that this is about fostering that convergence between alliances because there is a shared interest in doing so. European allies are not paying closer attention to the China challenge just because it is something that the United States cares about. It is because it is affecting our own security, and so we have a vested strategic interest in being actively engaged. And I think those conversations really took place in NATO since 2019. Of course, and I would be remiss if I didn't say that, in terms of the operationalization, a lot of this is done nationally, it's done through the European Union, and it's done through NATO-EU cooperation. So this is very important as well, and I would not wish to miss that reference, because I think it's part and parcel of how we operationalize that shared understanding that we have gained through that intelligence and information sharing.
So Tora, maybe back to you. You know, part of, I think, the model of NATO is and how countries can work and cooperate together. Has that example been something that do you think has contributed to an improvement in relations and in Japanese strategy? Or let me put it this way: has seeing the example provided by NATO of allies really working hand in glove together, is that a goal that Japan now has with its other Indo-Pacific partners? Has that impacted how Japan is thinking about how it does security? Obviously, there's a strong U.S.-Japanese partnership, but there's been tense relations with Korea and others. So I'm curious how Japan is Japan thinking about the NATO example when the U.S. comes with ideas like the Quad and other initiatives?
I think we think differently. We don't pursue institutionalization. I think, well, quite frankly, we envy this kind of an institutional setting because you're able to marshal resources in domestic capitals in the various countries, and you'll be able to have a secure platforms where you can exchange highly classified information. But unfortunately, we don't have that environment in the Indo-Pacific. So rather than pursuing an institutional all-in, all-out approach, what we are pursuing is more of a sort of a functional security/defense cooperation in the Indo-Pacific to, bolster deterrence. I've been working on this project recently, where how do we design an Indo-Pacific regional deterrence architecture? And one of the starting point of departure would be this concept of integrated deterrence, and you have three pillars, right? Deterrence by denial, deterrence by resilience, and deterrence by direct and collective cost imposition. I think you'll be able to identify some of the missions and capabilities that constitute or contribute to those functions, and try to identify which countries are able to contribute which kind of capabilities, and which countries are able to execute which missions. And if you start sort of plotting in a chart and doing a checkbox exercises, you will have different countries being able to play different roles in that region, in each of those different mission sets and capabilities. And so that's the kind of image that we have when we think about Indo-Pacific security. We will have different kind of formations. We'll probably have frontline states, supporting states, and maybe a backup state. Different countries will play different roles. For example, when we're dealing with South China Sea, Philippines obviously will be at the front line. When we're dealing with Senkaku Islands, Japan will be at the front line. And when it comes to Taiwan, US will be at the front line, plus maybe Japan 1.5, tier 1.5 role to sort of sustain and bolster deterrence. So that's the kind of image. It's not institutional, but it's going to be functional. And I think the ongoing lattice work exercise that's security networking that is being undertaken is exactly that. And one of the challenges of taking this kind of approach is that so many things are sort of, to put it in a rough words, it's scattered in a way. So many different military training programs and joint defense corporations. How do we present all these exercises in a coherent way? Because ultimately, the purpose of this exercise is to send a signal to China that Chinese arms buildup in the long term will not deliver military dominance because it will be met by multinational balancing. And I think this is a part where European countries can, help us send that signal by, partnering and cooperating on joint capability developments and interoperability, for example. So yeah, that's the kind of approach that we think about. So quite different from the NATO type model, I think.
And Jude, maybe over to you. Do you agree that that's really kind of our objective here is to not necessarily have this sort of institutionalized structure, but to have something a bit more ad hoc? And I think one of the challenges is working with the Europeans is sometimes there is a Europe where you can go to, such as at the EU, particularly on economic, but then on security you go to NATO, but then you also have to go to the individual countries, and Europe is an incredibly complicated partner in some ways in engaging. So is the objective here from NATO engagement is it to sort of facilitate sort of the stronger linkages on the security side that we in some ways had already kind of established on the economic side, of course through the G7 and other mechanisms which the EU and prominent European countries are all involved. So over to you.
Yeah, and I also wanted to, if I could pose a question to the group as I was just listening to this.
Yeah.
But just quickly on that, one of the challenges, yes, so I think the reason that there's no functional discussion of an Asian NATO is because we understand it would get zero liftoff. So that's why hence the lattice approach. Going back to integrated deterrence, though, and I like your tripartite structure of denial, resilience, and then punishment. One of the challenges, though, if I think about the pain points for China, is we still silo how we think about sort of economic deterrence, diplomatic deterrence signaling, and military deterrence. And so, a lot of the work that we've done has been thinking about the role that actors in the G7, but a larger grouping of countries in Europe and in the Indo-Pacific, what kind of conversations can they have now on the potential economic cost to China of a conflict that actually helps support existing measures on the military front, but those discussions are not often coordinated. And that seems to me an area where we're letting wind slip from the sail. There is an important component of diplomatic action as potential deterrent signaling to China, because you're really trying to create a bundle of costs that China will face for its aggression in pick the theater and also pick the area, South China Sea, Second Thomas Shoal, or Taiwan. The question I was going to ask is, in both for you and for you in hearing your discussion on the approach that Asia might take with Philippines taking the lead here and Japan playing a 1.5 role, I'm wondering if we're at a point where the United States is actively engaged with a hot war with China, how much are our neat divisions going to matter, and how much arm twisting is going to happen of, I think if there's, if destroyers are being sunk in the waters of around Taiwan, and this is more of a question, but you can probably sense my skepticism, how much are we allowing people to play a 0.5 role? And how much are we really saying, this is it? I mean, this is the moment. And for NATO, this is it. So I'm just curious for your thoughts on how much of this, how do you think about the messiness of what an actual conflict with China would look like, and how much we're going to allow space for allies and partners to sort of find their own way to engage?
No, I mean, that is one of the questions, right? And I think that's part of this entire project. A lot of it is discussing what would a first of all, what would a significant deterioration of the security situation in the Indo-Pacific entail for Euro-Atlantic security, and then the additional layer of complexity, what would a 1.5 two-theater contingency mean, both for Indo-Pacific and Euro-Atlantic allies. And I think that in NATO, the initial conversation is, of course, about the burden shifting element, which is how can we build the European pillar in terms of defense spending, defense industrial bases, exquisite capabilities and strategic enablers, so that if one of such contingency were to present itself, Europeans could convincingly and robustly increase the share of the burden in terms of the deterrence and defense of the Euro-Atlantic area. And that part is the easy bit of the conversation, right? It may be not easy to do, but at least theoretically, I think there is complete consensus around the table that that would be our role. But I think the second element is what else would be expected, and what else, especially on the below the threshold non-kinetic set of tools, would be expected from European allies in that contingency. And I think that is a discussion that is happening in capitals, not necessarily only or primarily through NATO, but I think it is a question that does affect NATO, because one can take a very legalistic approach, take out the North Atlantic Treaty and say, well, doesn't affect us. But that's not the politics of alliances, right? Even if something is not legally binding, it does not mean that it wouldn't have a very transformational impact on the balance of interest and power in the alliance, right? So I think those conversations are happening. They're not always easy, because they do entail some coming to terms with the fact that Europeans do need to contribute much more to the security and defense of the Euro-Atlantic area. And then they also require thinking about how do you balance between economic interests and national security interests, and how does reflect your economic policies in a way that contributes to integrated deterrence. That conversation is easier in certain capitals than others, as you may imagine. I think I'll leave it at that.
So, yeah, sure. So, possible Japanese response to a Taiwan contingency, and it could take different forms, but let's say we'll talk about full-scale invasion scenario. I think there are two angles. I think at the government level, the Japanese government and the US government are pretty on the same page about how to respond to these contingencies. And I think some of the new initiatives that are being launched and announced this week and followed up in the months following, there's going to be a solid plan about how to respond to these contingencies. My worry is about public opinion. And I think Japanese public opinion, we are not just certain what the reaction is going to be. If we see massive casualties, there's going to be fear and anger. And I'm not quite sure which feeling is going to dominate the public. It could be divided into half and half. Maybe the fear might prevail. And my sense is, looking at some of the public opinion polls, people do not have a deep understanding of what it means for Japan to see Chinese full control over Taiwan, which means that there's going to be a lack of public resolve to sort of sustain any sort of war-fighting effort. So, because over the past year or two, particularly after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there's been a lot of debate about Taiwan contingency. And some people have used this, you may have heard about Taiwan contingency being Japan's contingency. And most of the discussion focused on the military fallout from the conflict, about how many missiles will be flying at Japan and how many people will die and what are the economic consequences of the war. But if we sort of focus on that dimension only, obviously people would be scared and they would want to avoid that kind of calamity. And therefore, I think the kind of discussion that Japanese public needs to have is to sort of reframe the situation and think about, what would Japan's security environment look like if Taiwan falls under Chinese control? And if that happens, U.S. force posture will have to dramatically change because PLA will have free access to the Western Pacific. And I think the U.S. will be in a more difficult position to defend Japan and maybe also South Korea as well. And so Japan could be a sort of a strategic enclave in a sense. And as a result of that, Japan and the United States will be deeply opposed to any forceful unification of Taiwan. But China will use all its economic leverage to pressure Japan to accept China's full sovereignty over Taiwan. And if we sort of, cave in, that's the end of Japanese freedom and independence. So that's the kind of stake that we have in Taiwan. But we don't really have that kind of understanding or appreciation. And as a result of that, I think, people's public resolve to resist, they will not fully understand why they have to fight. And Chinese information operation can say, why does Japanese people have to die for Taiwan? And as a result of that, Japanese public opinion becomes very vulnerable. So in that sense, that is where we have to work on. And I think, in Europe, as well as also in the United States, we have to have this conversation about what it means to defend Taiwan. And sometimes we talk about the military consequences, we talk about economic consequences, talk about political consequences and technology consequences. But those are rather abstract, but I think we want to make that more vivid. What the world would look like. And if we start talking about that, I think European states will also see huge stakes. There are estimates about maybe 9 or 10% of GDP is going to shrink if we have a Taiwan contingency, and that's going to have a major impact on Europe as well. So I think in order to sort of identify which areas where European countries and Indo-Pacific countries can contribute in the more hard defense military cooperation area, it begins with an exercise where we have to think about what is at stake. And if the stakes are big, that means you have to invest more and take more risks. And I think that's the kind of exercise that each countries need to undertake, I think.
I'm going to also try to answer. I'm going to put panelist hat on since we switched roles a little bit. But I think you hit at something that is, Jude, a real challenge in how Europe kind of does foreign policy. That in sort of peacetime, there's often sort of a division between the kind of finance minister and defense minister side, where the EU finance minister and the NATO defense minister don't always sort of, one hand is not necessarily always talking to the other. It's part of the reason why the kind of wonky issue of NATO-EU cooperation is really important. NATO defense ministers say, spend 2%, and then finance ministers at the EU level say, cut your budgets. And that happens all the time and is currently happening. That's a continuous discussion. But we sort of just did a trial run with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And what we actually saw, I think some of the questions are about how would Japan respond. I think a lot of people were thinking, well, how would Germany respond to a Russia invasion of Ukraine? I remember talking before the war as Washington was sort of very sure what was going to happen. It turned out to be right. A German analyst thought that the German public response was going to be incredibly weak. And in fact, it was exact opposite. And I think what you would see in a Taiwan scenario is, there's thousands of Europeans in Taiwan. So it's not simply an economic issue, but you would have EU citizens potentially being in harm's way as well. And I think there would be an incredibly robust response, and part of what we saw on the economic side in response to Russia was that Europeans shocked, I think, Washington by their willingness to do certain things on sanctions that we didn't think they would ever do, such as freeze Russian frozen assets. Now, will they unfreeze them to seize them and provide that to Ukraine? Well, that's an ongoing conversation. But to me, I think that there's, when the chips are down and there's a real crisis, I don't think there's any question where Europe will be and whose side Europe will be on. The question then is, what tools does Europe have to intervene in a crisis? And I also think the tools Europe has today are largely economic, but given the major increases in defense spending that are happening, I think those tools will grow, I think, on the defense side over time. Now, I want to open it to questions. We have around 15 minutes left, but yes, you in the back. And if you could please introduce yourselves and please try to ask a question as well.
Hi.
And wait for the mic.
Hi, my name's Alexander Malik. I'm a student at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown. One of the critical takeaways from NATO, from Ukraine, the NATO, and specifically European allies, has been the duplication and fragmentation of capabilities, even within NATO standards, which has hindered interoperability, restricted economies of scale and procurement, and complicated supply and logistics. So what lessons can the Indo-Pacific learn from these issues, particularly in this sort of non-institutionalized lattice framework which you've laid out, and specifically what role could AUKUS Pillar 2 play in that? Thank you.
Fantastic question. And anyone on the panel want to jump and take this? Benedetta, I think, part of what the question is hitting at is that, NATO was supposed to set, and I think is setting standardization for armaments, but we've seen cases where 155, not all 155 artillery are the same, lots of different variants, and then challenges of actually being interoperable. And so curious what your thoughts are on that, and then the AUKUS part of the question, and how then, if we're having a lattice work, do we have interoperability or interchangeability, the ability to just provide each other weapons in a seamless way in the Asia context?
Yeah, so I very much think this is a very good question. I would say yes, there is one of the lessons from the last in recent years is how much we need to reinvest and re-energize our work on standardization, including material standards. But that is to say that still, I think European and North American allies through NATO have the best level of interoperability. And when I talk with our friends and partners in the Indo-Pacific, they certainly think there is a lot that we can learn. So before I go to the things that we need to improve, I think we need to start recognizing that over the past 75 years, we have built incredible levels of interoperability that we need to continue building up, partly because since the end of the Cold War, we let part of that standardization muscle atrophies, and that's another lesson. Let's never again let our guards down. But I would agree with that point. But for me, one of the most interesting lessons that we are learning in terms of the defense industrial base is partly, yes, we need to solve fragmentation, generate economies of scale, invest in more joint procurement and acquisition. All of this is true, but I think my starting point would be how we need to re-energize and rebuild our defense industrial base to really shift away for the past 30 to 40 years where we had this just-in-time model that simply was designed to fight wars of choices, not wars of necessities like the one we have today. And we are definitely doing that through NATO. The European Union is playing its part. I think it's very, very important that as we move forward and we do this, we also retain the transatlantic industrial ecosystem base. That is part and parcel of how do we have the capability and the interoperability. So I would also tell our Indo-Pacific friends that that's another lesson, that yes, develop endogenous capabilities, but also retain that common industrial ecosystem. And going to your point about AUKUS Pillar 2, I think there is tremendous level of excitement for all of those who are looking at tools that can really increase stability and deterrence and defense in the Indo-Pacific. And I think that's a really interesting space to watch, where we as European allies can also learn, I think, of too, and increasingly participate maybe in the future. So.
Yes, those are definitely some of the lessons that we want to learn from the NATO experience, and I think munitions interoperability is an urgent task that we have to make. Very easy to say, but difficult to do. But nevertheless, it's the right direction that we should be moving ahead. So. Defense industrial cooperation between Indo-Pacific countries and European countries and the United States is the ideal sort of end state that we want to aim for. And it's going to take a long time, but I think we have to start. That means that we have to start and move forward immediately. And as Benedetta said, the level of interoperability between European NATO countries and the United States is at the highest level, I think. And Japan is also aiming to achieve that. AUKUS Pillar 2 a la carte approach is something that I'm very supportive of. We're going to be dealing with these new emerging technologies being used for military applications. And I think for systems like UUVs and hypersonic, counter-hypersonics, and those programs in Pillar 2 are definitely where Japan needs to go. And I think there's enthusiasm. The reason why we are not yet prepared is we have some of the information security issues. We have to achieve a level of trust that would enable both United States, Australia, and the UK to be confident that there will be no security issues associated if Japan participates. So I think that's the right direction that we should be moving ahead. So
I would just say the pace of change over the last 3 or 4 years in Indo-Pacific has been extraordinary. Japan has been leading this, but you've also seen this in Korea. You've seen this in Australia. Obviously, this week we're going to see this with the Philippines. So for the limitations you have of not having a sort of treaty alliance defense structure like NATO, I think it's extraordinary what's been done. Several concerns on the horizon, though. It's hard to know if this momentum is going to be able to sustain over the course of political changes. Some of them may happen here. That may potentially zap some of the momentum. Second is, Taiwan's a big part of this, and it's a missing piece of this. The Taiwan military, in many ways, sort of has to sit behind the wall, peek its head over, but it's really limited by some domestic factors, but also by external policy about how much and how comfortable people are on engaging with the Taiwan military. And that's a problem. Because as we think about flashpoints, Taiwan's not the only one. South China Sea, there's North Korea, but it's certainly one of the big ones, and it's certainly one of the big contingencies that the U.S. and its allies are planning for, but we have a bit of an unknown quantity in what role would the Taiwan military play, and that's a key piece, both for the resiliency piece of how long can the Taiwan military hold out, but as we start approaching, we don't have much experience with command and control, communications, and that's not something you want to work out on the fly. So I think the big gap in this is that, and that's one that's, you can overcome that, but that takes a little bit more political will, and I completely agree with the raising the stakes, because so long as the stakes are not sufficiently understood, then there's not going to be the political will to say, look, we're going to take a little bit of heat from China, but this is too important to leave to something that we sort of build the plane while flying it.
Other questions? Yes, we'll take 3 at once. We'll go you, and then Luis. So right here first in the front.
Hi, my name is Mary Levitt from the Peterson Institute, which may explain why my questions keep having to do with trade. But you're talking about, building support or public awareness, and yet it seems to me that our own actions to build resilience may run counter to that. So, for example, we have today in the paper article about TSMC's huge plan in Japan. TSMC will be building 3 in Arizona. That will take time for sure, but once that so-called silicon shield is no longer so important, is there really going to be public support behind seeing, American soldiers and other soldiers dying in this area? So that's my question.
Thank you for the great discussion. I'm Komei Sasaki, Japan Chair Fellow, Hudson Institute. My question is about North Korea. I was surprised to see the statement of the NATO summit. Last statement said 1 or 2 paragraphs describe the North Korean threat, importance of North Korean threat to NATO. So I wonder what kind of discussions were conducted among NATO members to insert those paragraphs in North Korea. For the other panelists, I want to know what are the potential collaborations fields regarding North Korean threat among the Indo-Pacific allies and the NATOs.
Thanks, Luis Simón, CSDS. So this is a terrific panel. So this morning, this concept of adversarial alignments came up. And it's an imperfect concept, we know. It needs to be taken with a pinch of salt, blah, blah, blah. But you have on the one hand this Sino-Russian dynamic that Victor was talking about, Jude as well. And then on the other hand, you have these increasingly relevant links between the US-led Euro-Atlantic and Indo-Pacific groupings that you all talked about. My question would be, how does this adversarial alignment theme relate to the current situation in the Middle East, if at all? And perhaps, so that the question for the panel, but I'd be particularly interested in Jude's assessment of how China views the relationship between the current situation in the Middle East and broader dynamics of strategic competition.
All right, easy questions, particularly that last one. No, and I had a giant, we have 5 minutes left sign flash before me. So maybe each of you could take, could hit on one of them. So maybe Benedetta, if you could talk about North Korea and NATO, and then Satoru, if you could talk about TSMC, the removing of the silicon shield. Jude, that might be for you as well. And then Jude, the last one on China and the Middle East.
All right, I'll be telegraphic, but I think, well, partly this is part of the reflection on what flashpoints and potential crises and conflicts and instability in the Indo-Pacific region could have a ripple effect that could indirectly and directly affect Euro-Atlantic security. And that was the starting point to look at potential contingencies in the Korean Peninsula and how that would have a ripple effect on norms with respect to non-proliferation, with respect to upholding the rules-based international order. Also, of course, there is also a military and a economic negative ripple effect. So I think those considerations made their way into the final statement. And to touch tangentially upon adversarial alignment for how imperfect the term is imperfect, and yet I would say that since the beginning of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, we see that playing out. And again, Ukraine is unfortunately the laboratory with this. And the fact that we see significant quantities of North Korean ammunition being utilized by the Russian army to conduct its operations in Ukraine, that we do see the reliance on Iranian drones, all of it used in real time to kill Ukrainians on European soil. All of this is really crystallizing within European capitals the understanding that yes, these actors are different. Yes, they may have areas of friction, but here and now there is a growing convergence and strategic alignment that presents serious strategic dilemmas and hinders our deterrence and defense credibility. So we have to take it seriously. So I think the more you see the DPRK, Iran, and of course, most importantly in this relationship, the PRC, playing a role in supporting and sustaining the Russian war efforts, the more I think this notion of strategic alignment, as imperfect as it may be, still needs to be taken seriously and really demands our utmost strategic attention from my point of view.
Regarding TSMC transfer, I think it's true that you mentioned by pursuing resilience and transferring TSMC factories over to other countries would potentially sort of lessen the case for defending Taiwan. But I think Taiwan understands this, so they will not give away everything. And so their way of approaching this third country transfer is going to be, I think, a sort of a very minimalist way. Probably driven by political considerations, but their strategy is not to hollow out their strategic value in the semiconductor industry. And also Taiwan's strategic value does not only reside in the technological aspect. There are military implications, how the way Japan's security environment will be dramatically changed as a result of Taiwan becoming vulnerable to this kind of Chinese aggression will undermine Japan's security. That kind of notion will also be there as well. And so as a result of that, I think public resolve will be not be sort of frailing in a one-directional way. So that's my general understanding. Thank you.
Just very quick on the Silicon Shield. I mean, the most farcical end of this is when Vivek Ramaswamy said, we really only need Taiwan until 2027, and then we will basically have replaced them. I think I both agree that I think Taiwan feels very unnerved when it hears these conversations about we need you for your semiconductors, but oh, by the way, we're going to try to build these here. But I think they breathe a sigh of relief knowing that Arizona is not going to replace Taipei. Number two, though, I think Taiwan has to be aware that, as we saw with the earthquake last week, there's lots of reasons why it's not great to have an overwhelming reliance on a very, very small location for such a critical input. So I think what we need to do to have a more mature discussion is find ways to articulate a value of why Taiwan remaining a democratic, prosperous economy is good for the United States, for Japan, for Europe, without an over-reliance on this. It's because they produce a widget. But right now, unfortunately, the widget is really the key value proposition that political leaders can most immediately get into talking points that resonates. So I agree with you, but it is in general a confused discussion, and the idea of just even a Silicon Shield is a bit of a confused notion. But we haven't found a better, more mature, robust way to talk about this. You know, working on China, you have to talk about areas that are way out of your depth. This is one of them for me, where I just, especially I'm going to say that it's the clock's fault, but really, it's a really great question. And my fraud alarm would be going off if I tried to give you an answer right now to that really hard, sophisticated question, so I'll punt.
Good punt. We always but please join me in thanking our panelists. I thought that was an excellent discussion. And I will be passing off the microphone to Eva Pasoya to lead the next panel.
All right. There's no transition, there's no break, so please bear with us. I hope you agree this was a fascinating discussion, and a lot of the themes, actually, we will keep digging into them just by transitioning a little bit away from the NATO framework and broadening the discussion up, also including the EU, individual EU member states, and Europe more generally. So kind of getting back to the topic of transatlantic cooperation on the Indo-Pacific. So my name is Eva Pejshova. I run the Japan chair at the Center for Security, Diplomacy and Strategy, and I'll be your chair. And just to give you a little bit of a background, when we started this dialogue series just 4 years ago, the idea was to make best use of this unique momentum in Europe-US relationship, to further the cooperation, to get a little bit more constructive in coordinating our policies on China, and making best use of the strategic alignment on China to also get better in addressing together some of the common challenges in the Indo-Pacific more broadly. And you will probably see where I'm heading into, because the title of this discussion is Strategic Uncertainty in Political Change. The thing is that we are approaching a new electoral cycles in the US, in Europe, not so much in Japan, hopefully, but not in a major kind of changing way. And so the idea was that despite this unique political momentum, things are not to be taken for granted. At the last session, we heard about the Middle East. I mean, Ukraine happened since we started the series. Middle East happened just not so long ago, and there's more to come. So there's a lot of threats and challenges outside, but also inside this, this transatlantic relationship. that we need to be wary of. And the question is basically how sustainable it is. What can we do to make it sustainable? What is really the essence of this transatlantic relationship, and how can we be useful to each other in addressing those common challenges? So I'm really delighted to have representatives among the three speakers of the kind of broadly geographically speaking, the three regions, the United States, Europe, and Japan, speaking for Indo-Pacific more broadly. And I'll start with our resident, Catherine Pike, who is the senior fellow with the Australia chair here at CSIS. And Catherine has been serving for over 20 years in the US Marine Corps. So I won't get into this impressive CV that I was reading before this. But she has really a unique insight also on the kind of hands-on practical experience with Indo-Pacific security. Then Ramon Pacheco Ford Pardo, who is our own Korea chair at the Center for Security, Diplomacy and Strategy, and Ramon is also a lecturer at the King's College of London. He's one of the leading EU voices on the Indo-Pacific. And last but certainly not least, Shihoko Goto, who is heading the Indo-Pacific program at the Wilson Center here in Washington, former journalist and also focusing on a lot of the economic security issues. So if Mary Lovely is still around, she can still ask her trade questions. But let me start, since we are in Washington and on the American soil, let me start with Catherine, if that's okay. And I know this is sensitive questions, but here, well, in Europe, there's this kind of anxiety, obviously, over the next election in the United States. I know that you've been passive, you are American, but you've been focusing most of your time on the reactions also in the Indo-Pacific. How do you see the mood going? I mean, should we really be worried, or is it just a minor cosmetic change that we're heading into?
Thanks so much. And I should note, I'm no longer in the Marine Corps, so I can speak completely freely here, and I'm not speaking for the government at all. So I thought what I'd do is speak a little bit to reactions and what we're seeing in the Indo-Pacific, specifically with Australia and New Zealand and some of Oceania as well. We talked this morning, there was some discussion, some really great discussion about this idea of partners and alliances and this administration's deepening of a lot of the partnerships around the world. And we heard a little bit of that this last session as well. A lot of different words have been thrown out. Lattice work, network, there's web was used long ago, I think. But I think the bottom line is none of this is new, but what we have seen over the last few years is this idea that more can be done with this idea of partnerships and alliances globally, and that there's a way to operationalize these things and really make them functional as we move forward. And we've seen this through initiatives in the Indo-Pacific, such as the Quad, raising that to the leader level, some of the initiatives coming out of the Quad. AUKUS, obviously, is a really key component and a clear example of this as well. So, that's one facet that we've seen over the last few years. There's also been, I think, an increased focus on the idea of regional institutions, such as ASEAN in the Pacific Island Forum, and what those regional institutions mean in terms of strengthening a region's ability to be independent, to be sovereign, to push back on any changes to regional norms or international rules and norms. And so the focus on strengthening those institutions as well. And then, of course, there's been this cross, this deepening of the relationship between the Atlantic and the Pacific. And this has been only spurred on, I think, by what we've seen in Ukraine, obviously. But even prior to that, I think we saw a real furthering of interest in Europe for what was happening in the Indo-Pacific, and a recognition in the US that there's a lot of goodness to be had from increasing that connectivity between the regions. A clear example of this, and I'll just use one because there's many, In my previous position, I worked on the Pacific and strengthening our programming from the U.S. perspective in the Pacific Islands. This is, of course, a region that has been significantly neglected over the last several decades, taken for granted in many ways, and the U.S., as well as many other countries, such as Australia, New Zealand, that are deeply involved in the Pacific, have sort of woken up to the fact that this is no longer a region that we can simply take for granted as we look forward. And this real wake-up started, I would argue, in 2022 with the security agreement between China and the Solomon Islands, but it's been coming for quite some time. As part of this re-engagement, the U.S. started to look at how we work with partners and allies in the Pacific specifically. And the U.S. started an initiative with several partners called the Partners in the Blue Pacific. And this is just one example of many initiatives for the Pacific. But the Partners in the Blue Pacific was started between the U.K., Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and the U.S., and very quickly brought on board Germany and Canada. And these are not necessarily countries that you would immediately think of are keenly interested in the Pacific Islands, but they are. And in addition to that, we had the EU, France, and India as observers. And these are all because these countries and regions are keenly interested in not just Asia writ large, but the Pacific Islands region, understanding how important it is that we maintain influence, that we maintain the ability for the Pacific Island region to have its independence and its sovereignty. So all of this to say that with all of this positive trajectory, there's understandably concern, I would say, and a bit of anxiety that we are hearing from the region on what happens next, what happens with a potential change in administration. I was just out in Australia and New Zealand recently with our Australia chair, Dr. Adele, and we were in Canberra and Wellington having numerous conversations with government, non-government, and I would say questions 1, 2, and 3 were pretty much all about what happens next? What happens to, in Australia, specifically to AUKUS? That was the big number one question. What happens to AUKUS with the Trump administration? And we really heard two lines of thinking. One is, let's wait and see. Let's just pause everything, hold off, and wait and see what happens. And number two was, let's move forward, move out on opportunities, and prove the worth of these things now. I'm strongly in favor of option 2. I think that's the only real way to move forward. You need to, all of these measures and initiatives that we're talking about here are in the strategic interest of the United States, I personally believe. I think many of us do. There's a case to be made here. It's a pragmatic case to be made, and I think all of us, including the partners and allies that may be concerned about the longevity of some of these initiatives, need to be looking at and are looking at how do we make the case for these things. In Australia, specifically, there's a really keen debate going on right now. You can read any op-ed on any specific day about how to move forward, what to do in the case of a Trump 2.0. How do we look at preparing ourselves? Australia was in a pretty good position last time there was a Trump administration. There's a strong bilateral relationship there. The U.S. has a trade surplus with Australia, but things have changed. Stakes are a little bit higher globally, and now we have this huge initiative that Australia has jumped in on called AUKUS. So we see things like just yesterday, announcement of $83 million now invested from the Australian government into Sterling at Perth in preparation for the submarines heading there. Further talks on AUKUS Pillar 2, what that could mean for integrating our defense industries. I mean, these are all really good steps. Those steps will continue to need to be taken. There's going to be, I think, a lot of work to be done with the Australian public to maintain support for, and that's true for the US and the UK public as well, to maintain support for these initiatives. But these are all conversations that we're seeing happening in Australia. New Zealand, some similar conversations, also a lot of focus on, are we going to maintain our engagement with the Pacific Islands, which again is a very top of mind for New Zealand, given the strategic location of especially Polynesia, but much of the rest of the Pacific as well. So are we going to continue our focus and our engagement there and our work with our partners and allies? For the Pacific Islanders, there's of course the huge question of climate that comes up. if we think about a potential change in administration. And this is a really interesting one. Obviously, there was a huge sigh of relief in the Pacific when this current administration rejoined the Paris Agreement, and there's concern that that could go backwards. But there's another piece of climate with the Pacific Islands, and that's that, yes, mitigation is obviously extremely important, but these are not these are not top emitters. These are very low emitters. They are not themselves concerned with reducing their own mitigation. What they are concerned with is adaptation and resilience, and that's what you hear from the Pacific Islands. And that, in some ways, is a little bit easier of a conversation to have with the US and with others, because that deals with resilient infrastructure, that deals with critical infrastructure, more of a national security bent. So even within our own system, I think you'll see ways that those initiatives can be framed in much more of a national security framing rather than just a pure climate framing. And we may see some of those changes in arguments be made. But I think it will be, there's still going to need to be a case to be made for that international cooperation on the Pacific Islands. I'll leave it there, because I know we have a lot of questions in the room probably as well.
Thank you a lot. Thanks a lot, Catherine. Sorry, my voice is terrible, and I keep apologizing for it, but apparently it adds a sense of gravity if you just lower it. But no, I sense there's, in a way, it's interesting to zoom into the Australian case, and thank you for bringing up the climate change, because it shows that, in a way, all the American allies have been perhaps better prepared also from the first Trump administration. So we've all kind of come a long way already and kind of getting ready for it. So this various minilateral structures and cross-regional security architecture, or whatever you want to call it, has kind of, serves a bit as a safety net, I guess, and the possibility to include those topics that are perhaps more easy to be discussed on the agenda is definitely one thing that that is going to go forward for sure. Let me turn to our European, and here I will not just focus on the transatlantic or purely on the US dimension, but we have our own elections coming up, and actually very soon. Already in June. And we have seen how the European policy towards China and the European engagement on the Indo-Pacific is important in its own, but of course not just in the kind of transatlantic context. How do you see the European policy going forward? Is there going to be continuity? What are the biggest risks on our own continent?
Yeah, thanks, Ava. I'm going to talk about the important elections this year, of course, European Parliament elections, which, as you say, we have in June, so less than 60 days now coming up. I think different from the US elections, right? I think we have an idea what the outcome is probably going to be. We have this grand coalition, for those of you who don't know, with the Conservatives, the Socialists and Progressives and Renew, which is a liberal party, and it's very likely that three of them will retain a majority in the parliament, and that the Conservatives will actually be able to lead the process of naming the next president of the Commission, which very probably will be the same president we have now, Ursula von der Leyen. So in a sense, we can argue that there is going to be continuity, even though populists will probably get a greater share of the vote in Europe. Which means that, in my view, when it comes to European policy, EU policy towards the Indo-Pacific, I don't think there's going to be much change. I think we have reached a point where there is a broad agreement. Of course, some disagree. Some countries disagree with this approach. Some populists, as I mentioned, disagree with this approach. But there is this more mainstream view, which is broadly shared, really, that Europe needs to be engaged in the Indo-Pacific region, B, that Europe needs to work together with partners in the Pacific region, that in and by itself, it cannot really have an impact in the region, but working together, you mentioned, Eva, this morning, with Japan, with Korea, right? The partnerships with these two countries, security and defense partnerships, they will continue to be in place. At CSDS, we have a project, for example, on digital cooperation that Eva leads, digital cooperation with countries in the Indo-Pacific region. Again, Japan and Korea are top of the list. Others, such as Singapore, for example, may be included here. So I think that's not going to change, right? And I think not only it's not going to change, I think if there is a change in the US landscape that in Europe we certainly don't want, but Trump comes back to office, then I think this is going to be even further reinforced, right? Because that's going to be a natural reaction from Europe. Who can we work with at the global level if we have a US president who doesn't necessarily support NATO, doesn't necessarily have the same view that we have about Russia, right? And this is going to be your Japan, your Korea, or Australia. Some would include India. There is a debate in Europe about cooperation with India, but many would include India as one of the countries you want to reach out in the region. So I think that's not going to change. And I think what also is not going to change, because the change has already happened, is the view of China. And I think when we started this dialogue, as you said, this is the fourth iteration, the view on China had already changed. But if we go back 5 years, before the pandemic, there was a very different perception in Europe when it comes to China, right? And it's very interesting that now, I mean, all of us in Europe, I think we talk to Chinese counterparts that now come from think tanks, for example, that now come to see our views. And I think Chinese have realized that Europe has changed not because the US has forced Europe to change, which is the view that I think many Chinese policymakers and think tankers had in the past. Oh, this is all the US bidding, right? It's forcing Europe to take a harsher approach towards China, but that's not really the case, right? And a couple of weeks ago, right, Victor, we were in Europe, and you saw it in Germany, in France, in Spain, right? Even in Germany, they were telling us how the perception of China has changed. The policy towards China has changed. And I mentioned Germany specifically because sometimes it was considered to be the weak link, right? Germany is focusing on trade with China, and that's it. And it's not the case anymore, right? When in the past, some had this simplistic view that in my view, that I think has changed, right? And I think this will continue. Certainly von der Leyen continues as president. That seems likely as of today. You never know with elections, of course. She has been, and her cabinet has been one of the key drivers of this change in position towards China that we have had at European level. And interestingly, this is not about the EU only or EU member states, but it was mentioned in the previous panel, the EU-NATO relationship. And I think this has also helped to shape the position of the EU towards the Indo-Pacific, right? Not only because of the NATO AP4 framework, which is very important, and we have to remember most EU member states are also NATO member states, so we're talking about the same countries here, but also because this has brought the discussion about security in the Indo-Pacific to the forefront of discussions about security in Europe, right? It's not only about Russia's invasion of Ukraine, it's not only about what's happening in the Middle East, which in the past was the main focus that we had in Europe, right? Russia and the Middle East. Now Indo-Pacific is important. What China does in the region affects European security, and China directly affects European security, or some would say threatens European security. And not only in the economic security component, but also hard security matters we're talking about. So if we look at the discussion about something like cybersecurity, for example, in Europe, right? There's a big discussion, and again, in our center, we have projects that deal with cybersecurity, funded by the European Union, among others, because there is this keen interest on how do we deal with China from this perspective, others as well, of course. There is some discussion about North Korea, for example. And the two final points for my initial remarks. One of them goes back to the election here in the US. I think regardless of what happens in Europe, there's going to be a push towards greater cooperation with the US in the Indo-Pacific region, right? We see this as important for our presence in the region to work with as many like-minded partners as possible. And the US, regardless of who is the president, continues to be a democracy, continues to be a market economy, and clearly there are countries in the region, starting with China, that are not this type of regimes, right? So that's one point. And the final point for my initial remarks, I mean, I have mentioned that I don't think there's going to be much change in European policy towards the region. We do have elections in different European countries taking place. For example, in the UK, one of the countries more engaged in the Indo-Pacific region. I think that these elections don't really actually even change the policy of those specific countries towards the region. So that you don't see, for example, in the UK, it seems very likely that the Labour Party will form a government after 14 years of conservative rule. But when it comes to the Indo-Pacific, there's a broad consensus among key European countries, right, that the presence in the region is necessary. In the previous panel, there was discussion about AUKUS, and you also mentioned AUKUS, right? So if you look at the UK, there's this consensus. AUKUS is good for the UK, right? Doesn't matter if you're conservative or Labour. And I think this happens in different European countries as well, that the idea that we have to be more engaged in the region, we have to deal with a different type of China, Xi Jinping's China, which we see as a threat, at the very least a challenge, but as a threat. I think that has become mainstream not only at the EU level, not only NATO discussions, but even many European countries, right? And I will finish by saying that now in many European elections, China is a factor that is discussed. It doesn't maybe determine the way voters go, but if we go back 5 years, no one would have discussed China in a European election. And now China is central to the discussions that we have, not only about foreign policy, but in elections, right? And as I said, I don't think it determines how voters vote, but it's something that politicians realize they have to engage with. So that type of thinking is, in my view, is going to continue at the EU level, but also in different European countries. And I'll leave it there for my initial remarks.
Thank you very much, Ramon. Again, a positive one, and I fully agree that there is an ongoing trend that hopefully we can rely on. But to kind of close the first geographical setup, let me turn to Shihoko. We have all been amazed and observing Japan's emergence as this new regional security actor. It's been quite impressive over almost the last decade, but really accentuated roughly since Ukraine. And of course, there is a national dimension, there is a global dimension of this engagement, but the US-Japan alliance and the importance of the United States in Japanese foreign security policy is without any debate. So I'll still ask the same question, and I'm always, for the last couple of years, every time we discuss with our Japanese colleagues, there's this famous Moshitora question that comes up, which is really, what if Trump gets back to power? And I couldn't resist to bring Moshitora, a little bit of Moshitora here. Especially during a week where the Prime Minister Kishida is in town. So if you don't mind, would you enlighten us on what is, kind of just to summarize, what are the main stakes and what is the debate in Japan on the Moshitora question?
Yeah. So let me begin. First of all, thank you so much. It's really great to be here, and what a great time to have this event when there is so much attention being paid to Japan. This is truly Japan Week, and you go to the White House and you see the Japanese and U.S. flags, the Prime Minister, and there's the big state dinner, followed by the Prime Minister's address to Congress. You talk to any official from the United States or from Japan, and there is unity in what they say, that the relations between the two countries are really at an apogee, that there is very little that is, there is little light of day between the two sides. And what we are seeing is that there's greater coordination between the two countries to expand partnership beyond their own borders, and that's especially true in the Indo-Pacific. And at the same time, there are far greater expectations for Japan as a regional as well as global stabilizer. We talk about elections. We have elections in the United States. We have elections in the European Union. Tomorrow we have the National Assembly election in South Korea. We have elections in India. We just had an election in Indonesia. The list goes on. There's a lot of political change. And with that, there's also a great deal of change in public sentiment as well across the board. There has been surprisingly very high marks for Shinzo Abe as a visionary outside of Japan in particular, and that if Japan has been close to having a grand strategy, that its free and open Indo-Pacific strategy is seen as precisely that. And the success of it is that it has gone beyond the Japanese borders. It has been adopted essentially by the United States and also by European countries, and also in the some Indo-Pacific countries as well. In contrast, we see Prime Minister Kishida, who is facing some domestic political challenges, to say the least. But that does not take away from the fact that it is actually Kishida who has been successful in implementing the strategic achievements of advancing the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy back home in Japan. So it is Kishida who has ensured that there is domestic support for more military spending, that Japan does adopt counter-strike capabilities, that it does build up its defense industrial base. And what's really remarkable is that there hasn't really been any sizable domestic opposition to those achievements, to those advancements that Kishida has made possible based on the vision that was first initially outlined under the Abe administration. And that is a reflection of the changing realities that Japan is facing in an increasingly fragile and unstable region, and indeed an unstable world order. And there is greater appetite on the part of not just the Japanese leadership, but also amongst the Japanese public as well, that Japan does need to step up and do more and meet those expectations to deliver on Japan as this global stabilizer. And that has been seen especially as the Kishida administration talks about taking the Indo-Pacific vision beyond the region, that it wants a free and open international order. And I want to point out to three issues that Japan hopefully can work more together with Europe to advance that free and open international order. And the first one, of course, is Japan's unwavering commitment to Ukraine. And I think I should point out that that is quite an achievement, and it is a shift away from what Shinzo Abe had done. Shinzo Abe, of course, had much more of a conciliatory approach to Russia, and that was reflected during the Russian invasion of Crimea. But with Ukraine, what we have seen is that Japan from the get-go has been in strong alignment with both the United States and its European partners in taking action against Russia from an economic statecraft perspective, and also aligning itself in the United Nations as well. And I believe that when the Prime Minister does give his speech before Congress on Thursday, he will mention Japan's support for Ukraine. And it will be an interesting opportunity for Japan to come out as a champion for Ukraine, and the test of international support for the Ukrainian government, and to actually be able to distill the fact that the events that are unfolding in Ukraine are of great importance to the Indo-Pacific as well, and that the legacy of war is manifested in contested territorial boundary disputes, and that is the Indo-Pacific region, and Japan in particular, is still vulnerable to those disputes as well. And so the urgency to come to the support of Ukraine, even beyond like taking away the idea of Ukraine and the Taiwan contingency issue, it is an illegal issue as well for Japan to actually demonstrate its support for Ukraine as part of its efforts to support the free and open international order. Japan is also committed to multilateralism, and we've seen that, of course, with Tokyo working hand in hand when it comes to regional security. But it's also important to note that Japan has really taken the lead in promoting multilateralism in economic partnerships and economic development as well. So we've spent a great deal of time today talking about AUKUS and the development reframing of the Quad as well. But we also need to point out that Japan has been a leader in ensuring the free and open economic order as well. The most obvious is its continued support for the TPP, which became the CPTPP without the United States. It has now Britain as a member, but of course now countries like Ukraine, as well as China, Taiwan, Costa Rica, Uruguay are also making a bid to join the CPTPP as well. And Japan has really been critical, especially to ensure that there is continued engagement. It was critical to ensure that the accession of Britain actually moved forward as well. Japan has also been a key component of ensuring the success of IPEF, the U.S. trade initiative. Without Japan, it would have been not as easy to get some of the more the less U.S. inclined Southeast Asian nations on board to the framework. And I do also want to point out that Japan also has promoted economic values as well. Kishida's push for a vision of new capitalism kind of fell. It did not really take off. But this idea of focusing on socially sustainable growth within the rules-based international order, and this focus on developing and investing in global commons has really resonated beyond the Indo-Pacific, and I do believe that it resonates with some of Japan's key European partners as well. And then thirdly, Japan is championing a more realist approach in dealing with China. Yes, Japan, of course, is in alignment fully with the United States on the security front when it comes to dealing with the China challenge. But when it comes to and we also see Japan working together. Yes, we'll have the trilateral here, the United States, Philippines, and Japan. We've already had the trilateral U.S., Japan, Korea trilateral. We may see other trilaterals emerging as well. But we also see a Japan that is much more eager to embrace multilateralism on the economic front. And this is something that is really required to ensure greater commitment and support from the Global South. We've had discussions already about China's strategies, both carrots and sticks, the sticks being economic coercion and disinformation, but it also has been successful in investing more strategically in Latin America and in Africa in particular. Japan, on a cumulative basis, still remains this single biggest investor in Southeast Asia. On an annual basis, it has been superseded by China. But at the same time, Japan's focus on quality infrastructure development to invest in human capital and capacity building has been more and increasingly appreciated. And we are also seeing a shift in U.S. Development assistance towards the region as well. So let me end here now.
Brilliant, Chihoko. If I may follow up with you, actually, because you've touched upon several things. I'll start with Ukraine. In the previous session, we established, and we know there's quite a few reasons that have pushed or encouraged the rather courageous Japanese support of Ukraine, very vocal one. In the previous session, we heard that it is, the kind of back thinking about it is that we're here for you and you'll be there for us in case of need. And of course, we all remember the discussions and the many parallels that were made between Ukraine and Taiwan, etc. What, from the Japanese perspective, are the concrete expectations in a way, not necessarily in the Taiwan contingency, but in general from Europe? What does it mean you will be there for us? And you touched upon the economic security issues, you touched upon the many kind of shared interests. We know that there is a lot of progress in the Europe-Japan relationship, but we still, I think it's still worth repeating or perhaps emphasizing what is really the expectations on the side of the Japanese from European engagement in the region.
So going to this idea of what happens in the case of a Taiwan contingency, right? So we see a great deal of support from the international community for Taiwan, but it is still not clear what kind of intervention there will be. And this is a very specific example, and the threat to Taiwan is clear, and yet we still don't see that manifestation. So in answer to your question about what does Japan want, in exchange for this continued support for Ukraine. The concrete deliverables are not necessarily evident, but what we do see is that Japan is demonstrating, one, it is in alignment with the advanced economies and the rules-based nations, and it is demonstrating its own commitment by putting itself on the line. There is a political calculus to this, and the negative is that there could be pushback from Russia, there could be pushback from China, and those were the things that had hampered Japan in the past from aligning itself. It is now prepared to make its allegiance and its commitment clear. So that is one of the biggest developments that we have seen in Japan. And I also think in domestic Japanese politics as well, we have seen a tremendous deal of support for Japanese commitment to Ukraine, public support and public passion, really, to ensure that the Ukrainian refugees are treated with respect, with dignity. It has actually opened a conversation about Japan's role to international cooperation, international security, and also a very uncomfortable issue for Japan is about immigration, refugee acceptance. And it's been a wake-up call, and it's elevated Japan's own expectations of itself.
Thank you very much. I'll have a quite similar question, actually, to you, Catherine, if that's okay. You talked about AUKUS, you talked about Quad, and you cited the example of the Blue Pacific engagement. It's like, well, by the way, I live in Paris, so I would argue that the Pacific is actually quite a very traditional French territory. but so it's not entirely new in the region. You will probably already see where I'm going. It seems to me, or I guess perhaps in the kind of transatlantic conversation on the region, there was this perhaps misleading impression that the United States kept, persuading the Europeans to be more concerned about China or doesn't know anything about the region. Yet there has been an engagement, European engagement, different member states and France kind of stands up in the region. Where do you see, not necessarily regardless any administration, the best use of Europe for the US interests in the region?
And I should definitely clarify, France was right from the beginning in the talks about how the U.S. could do more and how we could all work together. A very key partner, obviously, with two territories in the Pacific. We often have these conversations with our European partners, specifically on the Pacific Islands, but we've had them as well on Southeast Asia and other areas. As I think was discussed a little bit in the previous panel, it's not necessarily, the distances are far, and there's obviously a lot of things to occupy Europe, within Europe as well at the moment. This is not a situation where I think any of us are saying Europe should be vastly ramping up security cooperation exercises with various partners, et cetera. Not to say that there isn't some of that already happening and continuing to happen, which is fantastic. UK ships, French ships, lots of cooperation in the region, which is hopefully going to continue. I think there's a lot of specific expertise. Again, I'm just going to refer back to the Pacific Islands because I think there's some really interesting areas of focus there that we had discussed with some of our other partners. Fisheries, for example, expertise on maritime domain awareness. We look at Canada has some of the, and I know that Canada's not Europe, but having some of the largest coastlines and some real expertise on how to manage fisheries enforcement. Everyone talks about, I don't want to go down too much of a rabbit hole here, but illegal IUU fishing is always talked about a lot. But however, in the Pacific, it's not necessarily illegal fishing, but a lot of times it's the unreported piece because of just the ability to manage such a huge swaths of oceanic territory and how important that is, not just for the Pacific, but for the globe, because we look at the tuna stocks and we look at the stocks of maritime resources there. So there's a lot of expertise out there in Europe. If we look at Norwegian friends, if we look at France, obviously, Canada, just across the board. There was some very interesting discussions on gender empowerment, and especially in parts of Melanesia, where we see very low numbers of women in parliaments and in leadership positions, and some expertise and work that could be done there. There's obviously health. I mean, I could go on all day, but there's so many areas of specific expertise where our partners can weigh in. The capacity building piece does not always have to be in mass. It can be in, again, technical assistance, expertise. And then, as was brought up in the last section, this idea of standards and of understanding how that was in the discussion of NATO standards and how we can look at that in more of a security standpoint. But I think there's other types of regionalism, and the EU as what an exceptional body that is. And we have many important regional institutions in Asia, ASEAN, the PIF, others, that can also have very important lessons to learn, I think, from our European counterparts. So really there's an endless amount of collaboration here and ways that we can work together.
Excellent, and thank you for mentioning my pet subjects like IUU and MDI, because I fully agree that's that. I'll turn to Ramon for one more last question, but before I do, already start thinking about your questions, because we will then approach the 20 minutes limit. And kind of a similar, I mean, during the closed door meeting this morning, I raised this idea that Europe will be Europe, alluding to the fact that yes, there will be continuity on China, but there will be also engagement. And as we know, the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz is heading to Beijing next week. Xi Jinping is coming to Paris next week. And we do see this, indeed, continuity, but including in the engagement. Do you think that can somehow hamper or, on the contrary, actually serve as a say, like a bridging element in our cooperation with the United States and Japan, or Korea for that matter? Because in that sense, with Japan, we share a lot of the similar approaches with trying to maintain a degree of trade or economic proximity with China, while of course being concerned about a number of security issues. Or is it going to be something that will, bounce back against us in the context of our relationship with Washington? I mean, so where do you see it? Can Europe play this kind of bridging role in that sense?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I will order what Shihoko said, right, about Japan on the economic front, right? Because I think in Europe we're on the same boat. There are concerns certainly about certain elements of China's economic behavior, and we have seen recently, for example, the foreign subsidies regulation passed by the European Union and being used, for example, to essentially prevent Chinese investment, for example, in Bulgaria, right, in the railroad system, in the train system in Bulgaria. So I think that didn't necessarily happen in the past, but now you see more investment screening, this type of mechanisms. But yes, no one in Europe is talking about decoupling, right? De-risking, but not decoupling. And you see this across the board, I would say. And that's why I'm borrowing from what you said, right? Because I think it's a similar approach. I mean, I see Korea taking the same approach. You don't see in Korea debate about decoupling. You see it about de-risking, diversification certainly becoming more central to the discussion in a way that in the past, it's not that it wasn't being discussed, but it wasn't considered as necessary because economic relations with China were good, but also political relations were okay. At least they weren't poor, never mind security. Personally, I don't believe in these bridging roles when it comes to the U.S., right? The U.S. has its own foreign policies, the superpowers. I don't think many countries want to be the bridge between the US and someone else, and this includes the European Union and European countries who also believe they have a special relationship with the US, and I make the point they believe because I particularly agree with this point. What I do think, though, is that Europe can be one of the countries, Europe can be one of the continents and US allies and partners that helps to bring this perspective to the US, right? Along with Japan, along with Korea, along with, even if you look at Australia, the debate in Australia about economic relationship with China, you know, it should continue, right? It shouldn't disappear. So I think it can help to be one of these group of countries that tells the US, well, this is our approach and we don't necessarily fully agree with you because we are not the US, right? We have a different type of relationship with China and a different position in the international system, which doesn't necessarily fully align with the US position. And this goes back to a point you just made about the visits, mutual visits that are taking place between Germany, China, France. But even right after the pandemic, we saw many European leaders going to China. Even though we have had the pandemic and that had really soured relations between Europe and China, but you saw the leaders of France more famously, but Germany, the European Union, Spain, different European leaders going to talk to Xi Jinping, right? It also has to be said that the conversation is not the same as before, right? I think European leaders now are more willing, and business leaders, political leaders, are more willing to raise their voice and publicly admonish China on issues which we disagree. That in the past may have been done behind closed doors, sometimes a bit openly, but not necessarily. I think was more behind closed doors, and now being this open discussion with China about, well, there are certain issues we don't like, right? Access to your market, subsidies that you're providing to your own companies. I'm focusing on economics here, but you can go into security as well. And I think that's also important to know that the conversation is not only sometimes portrayed as a note out to China, you know, they go to the Emperor Xi and say that everything is good. It's actually to have a proper discussion about where we agree, where we want to cooperate, but also where we disagree, and where cooperation is very difficult to achieve unless China changes its behavior.
So that's your unique chance to ask questions. Let's see, 1, 2, okay, let's 3. All right, please.
Yeah, thank you. With the paralysis of the post-war institutions, UN, WTO, OSCE, it feels like the real steering committees for international cooperation have become NATO and the G7. So given that, would Europe, Japan, and the United States support expansion of the G7, perhaps to include Australia and Korea? Do you expect that to happen?
It's funny because G7 was my bonus question in case there was no question, so thank you very much for asking it. Let's take all 3 and then we have more time to reply. Thank you very much.
Hi, Chris Martin. I'm an Army Foreign Area Officer focused on East Asia. So this question was kind of, I'm poking at the earlier panel, but it's relevant to you as well. And so there was a comment that institutionalization doesn't apply in East Asia. And, you know, I've been schooled a long time on our whole, you know, bilateral alliance system in Asia, but I would suggest that we're being a little bit too binary, and that there's institutionalization of cooperation is what it's needed. The difficult pole is the institutionalization of commitment, you know. And so if you look at AUKUS, that's a cooperation institutionalization. You look at the UNC sending states a little bit closer, you know, that's cooperation without necessarily commitment. So can we do a broader institutionalization, and maybe can Japan be a focal point or a leader for that, or does that leadership need to come from the US?
Thank you very much. Well, if you look at some of the academic literature on institutionalization in Southeast Asia and ASEAN, you would see that Japan has been historically playing a key role in that respect. So I'm sure it's a great question as well.
I'm Matteo Dien from the University of Bologna in Italy. I would like to ask a question to Shioko Goto in particular on Japanese contributions to Ukraine in the military sector. So Japan still has the 3 principles of arm exports, recently reformed, but still formally is forbidden to provide military equipment to a state in conflict like Ukraine. However, perhaps there is a space seeing Japan transferring PAC-3 batteries to the United States, and also perhaps an idea of copying the strategy that South Korea has been implementing, essentially providing weapons to Poland so that Poland can triangulate back to Ukraine. And this will be very, very important for Ukraine, but also for Japan in terms of stepping out of a comfort zone and overcoming another of the previous pacifist norms and legacies. What do you think?
Okay, so one question on G7, then institutionalization and Japan's military aid to Ukraine. Well, you can pick one of them, or you can try to answer all of them. So who was my last one? Let's start with Catherine, if that's okay, and then we'll leave Shihoko. She had more of the Japan-related questions, so we'll leave her for the end.
I'll tackle the institutionalization one because, oddly enough, that's a word that I find myself using quite a bit. So in my before coming to CSIS, I was at the NSC, and we were starting a lot of these initiatives that we were doing in the Pacific Islands and Southeast Asia. And one of the catchphrases that I like to think I created, but I don't think I did, was that we needed to institutionalize a lot of our initiatives as we look ahead to potential administration change. And I think that's a lot of what you're actually seeing happening in the U.S. government currently is a shift, and this probably happens oftentimes between administrations, a shift of programming out of the White House over to the State Department as we try to institutionalize, again, a lot of these commitments and to regularize them, just throwing out lots of IZE words here, into the following years. But just more broadly, I think that's absolutely right. I'm not sure who might have said that it doesn't apply to East Asia. I think just because things are perhaps not as locked in long term doesn't mean that the cooperation itself doesn't need to be institutionalized in some way. And how we do that, I think, is the real key. And that doesn't have to be just US led. We've seen part of what we've seen over the last few years, and I'm going to go back to Australia as they look ahead to potential shifts in US government administration, is a strengthening of relationships also between Australia and Southeast Asia, Australia and ASEAN. We just saw the ASEAN summit in Melbourne, where they Australia rolled out significant economic initiatives throughout Southeast Asia. So, whether that's a little bit of hedging in case there's some back and forth on U.S. commitment, or whether it's just a strengthening of that networked approach, I think we're going to see leadership across the board in trying to, again, institutionalize some of these things. So I'm not sure if that completely answered your question, but that would be my take on it.
Yes, and I'll take then the G7 question. I mean, we have two Japan experts here. I'm not going to answer that question because you know much better than I do. I actually brought an op-ed on this very same theme in Korean media, in Chong and Ilu, actually, in which I actually argue, and this was very much about Korea, but included Australia, right? That, I mean, de facto this is happening, right? And the point is this needed de jure? Is it possible, is it needed, right, de jure to actually expand the G7? Because in my view, de facto, you see the cooperation between the G7, Australia and Korea taking place in many different ways. You have countries, I mean, Canada is in favor, UK is in favor. The question is other European countries, the EU member states, are in favor or not, right? And we have an Italian corner here, and we saw this morning when this was raised that the Italian corner wasn't necessarily thrashed with this idea. But I do think that if the US took the step of saying we're going to include these two countries, I think it would be very difficult for others to oppose this, right? So it goes back to the special position that the US plays in many different fora, including the G7. So in a sense, I wouldn't say it depends on the US, because yes, ideally you would have the 7 plus, well, the EU is obviously participating on the meetings as well. But I do think if the US said, well, we think this is good and we're going to champion this, I think it would be difficult for the others to oppose this, especially because, as I said, some countries are in favor of that. And I mean, Canada is hosting the E7 summit next year, and they have informally told Korea they're going to invite it, right? So even 1 year ahead, and regardless of what happens this year, I don't know about Australia and Canada. But going back to my original point, I think de facto this has been, if not institutionalized, maybe that's not the word, especially since you just answered very eloquently the question about institutionalization. De facto is already a lot of cooperation taking place that will continue regardless of what happens de jure. And I don't know about Australia. I think in the case of Korea, obviously, they would love to be included de jure, and there's a consensus among conservatives, liberals, that this is good for Korea. But, and actually these days, those of you who meet with Korean officials, they give you 3 leaflets, right? The Indo-Pacific strategy, they give it to you. Also the June's foreign policy, right? And the third one that they give you is what does Korea contribute to the G7, right? So they already have the leaflet ready, right? And they give it around when you meet with them to make the case, oh, we should be part of it, right? Because look what about everything that we are doing for this. So they would love to. I don't think they will be pushing for it unless they see the door open with the US, as I just mentioned.
So there was a lot of concern about G7 becoming, going into oblivion because of its lack of relevance in the global economic order, that the dynamism was happening elsewhere, and having more countries being observers or participants in the latest G7 summit, including Korea, has been to the benefit of the G7 grouping. There are other groups as well, the G20, there's OECD, many other frameworks to promote economic interests and opportunities for cooperation. Flexibility is going to be key, whether one country or another or groups of countries should be part of the G7 and it should be expanded to G10, G15, or is not as important as the fact that there is an importance, an increasing importance and relevance for the G7 plus countries to meet on a regular basis, to keep the dialogue going, to talk about cross-border economic growth and economic security interests moving forward. So that's, and I also want to touch on this institutionalization issue. When the Japan, Korea, United States trilateral summit happened in Camp David last summer, one of the words that was used the most was about institutionalizing relations, and that was acknowledgement of the fragility of the relationship, especially between Japan and Korea. Again, we go back to the political risk issue. There is a need to ensure that any change in leadership or political party affiliation does not lead to a collapse or a reduction in that trilateral in particular, but also the upcoming trilateral with the United States, Japan, and the Philippines too. So in that loosely defined way of talking about institutionalizing relations, that it can actually overcome that political leadership and be resilient to political change is vital. And then on the issue of Japan and its military position, Professor Mori is a much better person to answer this question, but if I may share my 2 cents on this. What Japan has achieved under the Kishida administration to have a more militarily engaged Japan without changing its constitution, which Prime Minister Abe had pushed for so much, the fact that this has been achieved is quite an accomplishment under the current by this current Japanese administration. Now, we don't know how long this current administration is going to last, but this will continue to be a question of there is greater need for Japanese commitment. There is always going to be reluctance on the part of complete engagement because there has been no Japanese casualty outside of its borders since World War II. But at the same time, the fact that Japan has been able to have more military presence internationally is the acknowledgement by the Japanese public about this very rapidly changing international environment. So there is reluctant, hesitant acknowledgement by both the leadership as well as the general public about the need for Japanese commitment to change.
We have about 6 minutes, so time for one quick last round, if there are any questions. Okay, if there are not, I guess 5 minutes is just about, fine to kind of nicely wrap up without rushing. It's funny because when we're talking about the G7 plus, it somehow reminds me of the D10. That, it's when you look at the membership, it's exactly the three missing ones are the ones that we're actually talking about. But yeah, perhaps we should revise the D10 and just get into another alphabet. And perhaps we could, also think on how to further institutionalize the transatlantic coordination on the Indo-Pacific. Now that we know that all the usefulness of the word. But let me just thank the speakers for their very constructive ideas. It's been the fourth round, and every single, or at least the last and this year, every time I think about how to carry this dialogue further, we kind of finish with more ideas than when we started. And every time we have this ambition to break it down into more, concrete working sessions. And just from this conversation and our previous panels, I can just think of so many of them. So I really hope that next year we will meet again and perhaps dig deeper into this idea to break it down into more specific expert workshops. And I'm sure that if that happens, when it happens, we can count on your presence because we have been very positively surprised by the degree of interest that this dialogue has been and the traction that we have been getting in Washington. And this is all thanks to CSIS, of course, who have been the best host ever and the best co-organizers ever. And of course, as Luis has said in his opening remarks, nothing would have been possible without the support of our Japanese colleagues in Brussels. So thanking them also and everyone on distance. Thank you for all coming and hopefully see you next year.